So thank you all again for joining us for our second meeting. Let me just jump in here. So we have a pretty full agenda, as you know. We have the remaining 6 questions I want to get through, and then I moved the roundtable discussion to the end of our agenda today. So thinking we could, we'll see how the discussion goes with the questions, but gives us a little buffer and leaves plenty of time at the end for wrap up and final thoughts. So similar structure to the agenda last time. I'm just going to try to dive into the questions quicker this time, but run through the questions. I'm going to be talking a lot, unfortunately, but I will try to summarize the comments that came in and then really looking for feedback and discussion from you all of points you agree with, disagree with. I'm trying to really crystallize and better understand the different perspectives out there on some of the key issues. So one change this time is you will see we've inserted a kind of discussion prompt slide at the end of each topic. So some food for thought there that hopefully will get some discussion going on each of the topics as we go. And then before we get into the questions, this time we're going to do a little background. It was a recommendation from some folks after the first meeting that just for some stakeholders who aren't as familiar with all the activities going on in the region with regards to evolving regionalization and energy markets, just wanted to provide some level setting. It'll probably be a review for some of you, certainly, but wanted to just provide some of that information out there for the group. But first, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Ruchi.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you again this morning. You might remember this slide from last time as well. So as Adam mentioned, we're hoping that we can support and facilitate a great conversation in our kind of remote environment here. Similar to last time, RTO Advisory Committee members and ODO staff are panelists, so you should all be on camera and be able to sort of unmute yourself and talk amongst yourselves or ask Adam questions. We also have people really interested in this process and listening in, and we will have time reserved at the end of the agenda, as you saw from the previous slide, for public comment, and we'll be watching the Q&A and raising hands to make sure that we're able to unmute you and have you speak up with your questions. And then a quick reminder on those community agreements that some of us, I mentioned, attended a DEI conference a few weeks ago and really liked these community agreements and are looking to carry them forward into some of our work. So really just designed to help foster an inclusive and respectful workshop today, being present and ready to learn, being respectful to others, and reminding ourselves that learning happens sometimes outside of our comfort zones, listening to learn, not necessarily to respond every time. And just in general, thank you for being flexible and patient around any technology needs or changes. If you need something, if something's not working for you, please let us know. We will try to fix it and have you be able to participate in the meeting. And my colleague, Linda Ross, is on the line to help with that, as are many ODO staff. Next slide, please, Adam. And again, just a reminder of our mission and what we do. We went over this in detail last time, but it's just, I think, helpful to sort of explain where the department is as it relates to this work. We see it very much falling within our mission and what we do as an agency that's helping Oregonians make informed decisions and maintain a resilient and affordable energy system while advancing solutions to shape an equitable clean energy transition, protect the environment and public health, and responsibly balance energy needs and impacts for current and future generations. This work of the advisory committee at the direction of the legislature is really in line with what we do as a central repository for data, information, and analysis, a venue for problem solving Oregon's challenges. Education and technical assistance are the key ones here. So with that, I'll hand it back to Adam.
Great, thank you, Ruchi. So just a couple of welcome remarks. A lot of this will look familiar from last time. I just wanted to restate again the objective that we have for this effort as a department. So it's really, we see this as to gather and synthesize the range of perspectives on the benefits, costs, opportunities, challenges, and risks of RTO formation that exist among a diverse range of Oregon stakeholders to inform the state legislature and other interested parties. So you've heard that a few times last time, and you'll hear it a few more times today, but just wanted to restate it for everyone. So we already went over today's agenda a little bit. Again, a note that we're going to be recording this just so you're aware, and if you're interested in sharing it with anyone, we have a link up for the first meeting, and we'll do the same for this one when it concludes. And just another reminder on sort of process here. We are working towards a report that's due at the end of the year. We will give this committee a minimum of 2 weeks for review. In an ideal world, I'll get you more, but I'll give you at least 2. And then, as Ruchi mentioned, we will have public comment at the end of today's agenda. So if you're on the line, not as a member of the committee and are interested in providing comment, enjoy the discussion and hang with us, and we'll make time at the end. We have 30 minutes, but if there's more needed, we'll take as much as we need. And then just a quick reminder again on the timeline where we are. Kicked this off really over the summer, had our first meeting a couple weeks ago, second meeting today. I have had on there since the beginning a tentative third meeting, which I don't anticipate needing, but I'll revisit that at the end of today's meeting and ask you all for feedback on that. If there's some strong interest, then we can consider it. And then there's just the rough timeline there to get the draft out to you all, to give you 2 weeks to review, so we can get it turned around for the legislature by the end of the year. And with that, I want to do some quick introductions. And this, I was thinking we could just do a roll call introduction. Just let me know if you're here for everyone, just so we can dive quicker into the substantive agenda today, since there's a lot of material to cover. So I'll go down the list. Senator Taylor, I don't believe, was able to join us this morning. Representative Marsh?
I am here.
Great, thank you. And it looks like you're not on the floor this morning, so
No,
thank you last time.
Probably can pay better attention today.
Commissioner Tawney.
Good morning, all. Looking forward to the conversation.
And Kristen Sheeran, who is on our advisory committee, for those who don't know, has left the governor's office, and her replacement, Amira Streeter, I believe is planning to join us for part of the agenda today. So we'll have her say hello if I see her join. Scott Coe, did not see Scott from Emerald PUD. Nicole.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you to Linda for helping me deal with some technical issues this morning.
Glad you could make it work. Robert.
Good morning. I'm here today.
Thanks, Robert. So, Frank.
Yeah, good morning, Adam. And good morning, everyone. As I mentioned to you, Adam, I will need to depart sometime around 9 or 9:30 this morning, unfortunately. But look forward to the conversation between now and then. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Frank. Sarah.
Good morning, everybody. Happy to be back. I will hopefully be in a position to be on camera shortly.
Great. Thank you. Oriana.
Hi all, it's Oriana Manera. I'm with Verde, and I too will be on camera shortly. It's good to be here.
Great. Travis.
Good morning, everyone. Travis Erie, Business Manager, Local 125.
Thanks for joining us. Lindsay. Oh, that's right. I believe Mary Winkie is here on Lindsay's behalf. So I see Mary on the line. I don't know if looks like she's on mute at the moment.
Sorry about that. I was trying to speak and I was on mute. Yes, this is Mary. I'm here for Lindsay. She's out on family leave now. I am having some technical issues this morning, so I'm going to log off here in a minute and try to log right back in, and then I'll be on video.
Great. Thank you, Mary. Spencer.
Morning, Adam.
Hey. Ravi?
Hi, good morning, Adam and everyone.
I'm not able to turn on my camera, but I'll see if I can fix it. But glad to be and happy to be here.
Thank you. Fred.
Morning, everybody. Fred Hewitt. That's the backdrop of knee tarts this summer. More interesting than my kitchen.
Kathy.
Good morning. I'm here.
Ben.
Morning, everybody. Good to see and hear you all.
And Ben, just so you're aware, we have a view of a piece of paper. I'm not sure if that's intentional or not.
That's not. Give me a second. I'll fix it.
No problem. I suspected maybe not. Mike. Much better, Ben.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Adam. Mike Getz here from Oregon Cub.
Great. And I don't believe Mary is able to join us from DEQ. Great. So it looks like we have just about everyone here. So with that, let's jump in. So this will be a bit different, like I mentioned earlier. Definitely some review here for some folks, but again, just wanted to provide some level setting, both for members of the committee and for members of the public who are listening to this and kind of wondering where this conversation is coming from. It's there's quite a bit of activity going on in this space. So we just thought we would review it briefly. And Commissioner Tawny, thanks to you. She's kind of co-present some of these slides with me here. So just kind of want to touch on three major kind of substantive functions that kind of accompany these conversations a lot that I wanted to mention. So one is really just buying and selling electricity. That's kind of the one I think we talk about a lot with RTO markets, for instance. And that's really just buying and selling electricity to ensure that customer demand can be met in real time. Then there's the issue of resource adequacy, which is really about planning and evaluating, procuring sufficient capacity to meet future customer demand. And then transmission planning and operation. So identifying the needs to maintain system reliability and be able to deliver that generation to meet customer demand. So those are the three main categories. A little more detail on each of those just at a very high level, but sort of the kind of time frame and time horizons that each of these kind of buckets looks at. Buying and selling electricity can happen over a wide range of time frames, from years into the future through power purchase agreements, months ahead, day ahead, to real-time markets happening on sub-hourly intervals. Variety of mechanisms, but the two majors that come up in these conversations: bilateral agreements and centralized markets. And get into a little more about what that means exactly. Resource adequacy. Again, some variety here in the time horizons, but typically on a planning basis, it's looking out 3 to 5 years. But then there's some shorter timeframes involved as well, thinking about whether there's sufficient capacity to meet future demand. And the mechanisms here vary widely across the country, certainly. So I won't go into much detail here, but very BA specific. And what's a BA? We'll get to that in a moment as well. PUC role in planning typically. And again, multiple different types of mechanisms and agreements for resource adequacy. Transmission planning and operation. So on the planning side, this is probably, I would say, the longest time horizon of the three major categories here. That can be really 10 plus years when you're looking at identifying a need, siting, permitting, building. It's quite a long process. And then, of course, in operations varies widely down to the, seconds. And again, a wide range of mechanisms there, particularly on the planning side, a lot of variation across the country. So balancing authorities, or BAs, as we talked about last time, you'll hear again a lot today. What does a balancing authority do? At a high level, it reliably plans and operates the high voltage electric grid. Each BA balances in real time the load in their area, generation, and the net interchange, so the imports and exports with other neighboring BAs. So here's a map at the right here showing several dozen BAs across the Western United States. I think it depends on how you count it, but it's in the 30-some range. And just highlighting a few notable ones here, you can see BPA-T on the map, which is Bonneville, PAC West there in Southwest Oregon, you can see, and then call out also the big lime green there in the middle of the map is PAC East. Then PGE, of course, around Portland. And then I've also noted here to our south, of course, the teal colored CISO being the California ISO. So where do RTOs currently operate? There's 7 currently operating across the country. RTOs or ISOs, and for today's purposes, we'll say they're interchangeable. And kind of across those 3 major buckets or functions, each one operates day-ahead and real-time energy markets. There are significant variations, as I mentioned earlier, on the capacity side, and that's true certainly of RTOs as well. A big variety in terms of how RTOs are involved in capacity planning and procurement and maintaining resource adequacy. And then on transmission, more similarities in terms of each centrally operating and optimizing transmission while ensuring open access. And then a quick note here, just a little more background on bilateral transactions, because you will hear a lot about the bilateral market or the bilateral system that we have today in Oregon and the Northwest. It's just like it sounds, really. It's an agreement between a willing buyer and seller to exchange electricity or energy, capacity or grid services. And it really is the dominant form of transaction in vertically integrated markets that lack RTO energy markets. So that's a little bit of background, and then I will turn it over to Commissioner Tawney to walk through some of the more recent evolutions in terms of programs that are evolving across the West in recent years.
Thanks, Adam. And many of you in this group are involved in these initiatives, so I'm by no means the expert, but just for folks that aren't following it quite as closely, you saw the big white space in the West for RTOs. In that white space, there's a whole variety of initiatives, either in progress or already stood up. So the first that I want to cover is the existing Western imbalance market. It was launched in 2014, and you can see all the participants in what was that white space across the West. This is built out of the California ISO, and it optimizes the generation on the sub-hourly basis. So for those thinking about the comparison to the bilateral market, this has really replaced trades that might have happened in the 15-minute or 5-minute sort of space in less than an hour. And it's grown quite extensively and continues to grow. I chair the EIM body of state regulators, which is the Western regulators' way of representing state interests in the California ISO conversations around the EIM. That's brought a lot of benefit because it's optimized the dispatch on that sub-hourly basis. So we've gotten a lot of fuel cost savings and a lot of value around being able to absorb California solar on a sub-hourly basis and sending down hydro and other resources on a sub-hourly basis. It's really been able to integrate more renewables around the West on that sub-hourly basis. Let's go to the next slide. So the CAISO is thinking about how to move from EIM from the sub-hourly basis to the day-ahead basis. So we would start to move from doing a optimization on just that 15 and 5-minute to planning a day ahead. Right now, every BA does that plan independently. If we got to a day-ahead market in that California CAISO footprint across the West, we would optimize day-ahead. There'll be a forum next week to launch that conversation across the West. Many of the participants in this committee will be at that. And many of the utilities, all of the utilities in Oregon are engaged in that conversation in one way or another. SPP has a big market on the Eastern Interconnect. So there's kind of a very thin bridge between the Western Interconnect, all the white in the West, and the Eastern Interconnect. SPP is working across that bridge. On the east side of the interconnect, they have a full RTO. You see that in the light red spaces. But in the West, on our side of the interconnect, they have established an imbalance market. So again, sub-hourly optimizing for those utilities. Same idea as what we have with the EIM and the California ISO, but a different set of utilities involved here. At this point, primarily public power is involved in that, although I know there is a conversation on the east side of the interconnect about how that might evolve and grow. SPP has been really clear, as have some of the participants in the WISE, that they want to move to a full RTO by 2024. And so they're in the process of running an effort to migrate that imbalance market, not just to a day ahead, but all the way to a full RTO. I think it'll be interesting to see how that process unfolds, what that final governance looks like, and so on. There's a lot of conversations in both of those ongoing initiatives about what the governance will look like and how regional it will be. Let's go on to the next slide. So in addition, the Northwest Power Pool has been establishing what's called a resource adequacy program, and I apologize for those of you who are the ones actually building this and deeply involved in it, because as I make a hash of it. But essentially, where the EIM and EDAM is talking about optimizing transactions and dispatch on a day ahead or a sub-hourly basis, or that's what SPP's WISE is doing today. This is looking at the 7-month ahead to 3-year ahead and asking, are we resource adequate? Do we have enough resources? Does everybody have enough resources to meet the needs of the whole region? The Northwest Power Pool name makes it sound like it's just here in Oregon, Washington, Montana, et cetera. It's not. It's got a very large footprint across all of the West, and so the Resource Adequacy Program is Western Resource Adequacy Program, WRAP. That is in the process of just getting stood up, and we'll see how it continues to evolve. And it is unusual, but not unprecedented, to have your RA, your resource adequacy conversation, happening in a different place than your RTO. CAISO does it that way, or COT sort of does it that way. But I think because of how resource adequacy is handled in California, it makes it very difficult to sort of take the California RA model and spread it across the West. And so then we have the rest of the West saying, how could we do RA for ourselves in a way that works for us? Really exciting, potentially a lot of benefits for customers around optimizing how much generation we build during this transition, that we don't overbuild, but we don't underbuild. And really important governance questions that are in discussion right now, again, around how folks are represented and who's at the table when decisions are made around this program, because it will have really substantial impacts on how prices are formed for long-term contracts, and how transmission is valued, although it doesn't directly touch on transmission. Let's go to the next slide. So we've covered the market bucket that Adam pointed out, and the sort of 2 efforts that are going on that. We've covered the RA resource adequacy bucket that Adam talked about at the top, and the Northwest Power Pool's effort there. Now let's talk about transmission. Here in the Northwest, in our region, we have Northern Grid. This was created relatively recently by bringing together 2 transmission planning organizations that were sort of interlaced. Their footprints were interlaced, so that we can now have a better, more holistic picture. This is the organization in our area that does that 10-year planning. And again, in an RTO, that role would be inside the RTO, but we don't have an RTO, so we have Northern Grid instead. What doesn't get done in sort of any of these right now, although you could kind of increment towards it in the CAISO work on markets or the SPP work on markets is that centralized optimization of the transmission system that Adam talked about. So that's sort of an important, outstanding optimization that there isn't a very clear path to right this minute. Although I think as the market pieces at the, start to fall into place, perhaps there is a path there towards that optimizing use of the transmission system, not just planning. And then the next slide, last slide. So the West, as the last slides have shown, is a real patchwork, right? We see the value of different elements of an RTO. We've gone about trying to capture some of those values in different ways. There are some institutional complexities that are why we have done it that way, not least of which is that we've got FERC jurisdictional utilities and non-FERC jurisdictional utilities in our region. In the meantime, the RTO, there's been a campaign to move forward RTO legislation across the country, in the Southeast as well as in the West, and that's resulted in RTO legislation in Nevada and Colorado that both require those utilities, the transmission providers, to join a full RTO by 2030. And it sort of forces the question, it becomes a forcing function on, well, what is that going to look like? And if they go to an RTO, what happens to everyone else? And I'll say, just for those who haven't followed these efforts very closely, there was a really interesting sort of reality that emerged as the California ISO's imbalance market really took off, where those utilities that weren't in it really found they had no counterparties in the bilateral market. So Adam talked at the beginning about how the way we do things in the West has been historically the bilateral market. As folks moved their transactions into the imbalance market in the sub-hourly basis, there wasn't anybody to transact with anymore, not as many people to transact with anymore in the sub-hourly basis. And it became a question of joining because you had to, because that's where the market had moved. And I think for me, this RTO legislation in Colorado and Nevada raises a sort of similar question. If they go to an RTO, where does that leave Oregon customers? We have the study bill here, SB 589, that's led to us and this conversation. But you can see there's a lot in flight. There was an additional effort announced yesterday, centered in the eastern side of the interconnect, but covering our utilities as well here. And to explore what an RTO might look like, led by several utilities, both public power and IOUs, investor-owned utilities. It'll be interesting to understand better what that effort is trying to unpack and suss out. And across the board, as we've seen in the state-led market study and the literature review that Adam included, the bigger the footprint, the more economic benefits. The flip of that is, the more people you have to work with and figure out how to get along with and manage through. And so you have to find that sweet spot, from my perspective, between customer benefits and state policy. So I'll leave it there, Adam. I think that's a quick run through how much activity is going on in these spaces.
Great. Thank you so much for the background. And just one final note here, for those who want to dig even deeper, I would encourage you to check out our website. We have quite a bit of information, both on the SB 589 website in particular, links to background materials relevant to RTO formation, the technical studies that are out there, just really a ton of information out there we've linked to. And then, of course, our 2020 Biennial Energy Report also provides some good kind of 101 and introductory material on many of these topics. So I encourage you to look there if you're interested in learning more of the background. So with that, let's dive back into the questions and the feedback. So I'm going to start with a general feedback, which these are actually, I guess I have a prompting question slide here. But so the remaining slides are going to be focused on all the comments we received, just like we did in our first meeting. Again, our purpose here is to really help crystallize perspectives so we can accurately represent them to the legislature. And again, worth reiterating, our purpose is not to reconcile opposing perspectives, to formulate recommendations. We're trying to understand the opposing perspectives to the extent they exist so we can represent those, but not trying to reconcile and make recommendations. And so as you go through the feedback that we present from the comments that came in, just some prompting questions to think about. Do you support or oppose a perspective represented? Would you emphasize something differently? And is there something missing? So I'll present these prompting questions again at the end of each topic, along with a couple of other kind of more substance-driven questions based on some of the comments that came in. And once again, I won't reread this, but just our objective statement, once again, what we're trying to accomplish here. So general feedback. So these are two comments that I shared last time, but they really are, I think, relevant to the whole discussion. So I thought I would just display them again. The first is, several commenters commented that it's really difficult to answer some of the questions we posed without a concrete framework for general market design, capacity requirements, rate structure, et cetera, as each element could potentially have significant impacts on ultimate outcomes. We certainly hear that and recognize that and want to acknowledge that again. But one member suggested that this uncertainty in particular is reason to forgo additional technical analysis until there's a proposal on the table. And context, it's our hope, as some expressed, that the high-level feedback provided through this process will provide helpful context and baseline information to help the state and interested stakeholders better understand the issues that are implicated in RTO formation. And with that, we'll go into question number 6, the first substantive question for today. So transmission planning and operations. Of course, that picture has nothing to do with either one, but I didn't change my pictures between meetings. So this question was really about, an RTO would provide coordinated transmission planning functions and centrally operate the system. So we're looking for feedback on how impacts of transmission planning and operation would or would not be preferable to the status quo from RTO formation, with a few kind of sub-questions around generation interconnection, transmission planning and expansion, cost allocation, and legacy transmission rights. I believe this is the longest topic we have of the day. There's quite a bit of feedback here, so bear with me. I'll feel free to cut me off, and we can pause on a particular slide, or I can just run through it to the end. I think that worked the best last time, but feel free to jump in. So first, general feedback. Multiple commenters offered general support for the findings identified in the literature that RTOs can deliver net benefits from coordinated transmission planning and operations. So the larger geographic footprint and more visibility can optimize transmission planning and operations. Our RTO could obligate generators to vary output to manage transmission congestion. Oregon's recently adopted 100% clean energy standard makes this more important. Formation of an RTO is the next progression to, quote, best achieve regional goals. And one commenter cautioned that, quote, it will take considerable work to find the balance to equitably allocate costs and convert legacy rights. So it's certainly an issue we'll talk about. Streamlining the current process, sort of a counter view. One member suggested that RTO formation could, quote, bring about additional obstacles to investment in transmission, and that the state instead should focus on streamlining the approval of new transmission assets. Generator interconnection. Open access, current generation interconnection process attempts to, quote, equitably allocate the risks of cost recovery, but there may be improvements under an RTO. Efficiency, RTO may more efficiently manage queue of projects regionally, particularly when a project in one utility's queue might impact a project in a queue of another utility. Interconnection queues. this one came out several times, that this is a recurring theme we'll hear, is that an RTO might not solve all our problems, right? RTO formation will not automatically resolve full generator interconnection queues, as utility would still be obligated to coordinate it through affected system studies. But it was noted that RTO design can ensure projects are built on reasonable timelines and don't hold up the queue, and that including a cluster study approach to process requests could help manage the queue. So that's certainly something that's done in other regions. Standardization. An RTO could standardize interconnection through its tariffs and business practices to ensure uniformity across a broad area. One commenter believes this will likely help a greater diversity of resources interconnect. Multiple commenters believe this will reduce biases for utility-owned resources. And standardization can establish a predictable, consistent process across the region that improves upon the inefficient and ineffective status quo. With a particular note there of long interconnection queues and high deposits specifically for smaller projects. Cost allocation. For new transmission, existing RTOs have also struggled to plan for and allocate costs for major new transmission lines. But one commenter suggested, quote, the problems in the RTOs are better problems to have than Oregon's status quo with separate, quote, transmission fiefdoms. One view, the status quo effectively has, quote, no regional mechanism for cost allocation, which hampers the development of desperately needed new transmission projects. But another view, cost allocation has not been the largest hurdle to new transmission development, and the costs of projects spanning multiple entities are handled through bilateral transactions. Process. RTO structure should be rooted in cost causation principles and should include a collaborative process for accepting or disputing an RTO's determination of transmission benefit. Permitting. One commenter noted there are often risks associated with the allocation of the costs of the time and effort associated with permitting transmission projects. And more on cost allocation here. Benefits. FERC Order 1000 requires cost allocation to go to customers that receive the benefit from the transmission project. And RTO design can require transmission benefit analysis to reduce the potential for non-benefiting customers to bear costs. But who benefits? It was raised that some projects, such as segments designed to access new renewable resource zones, may arguably benefit all customers. So some difficulty there. Experience from other RTOs shows more success in developing large transmission projects that benefit a broad base of customers that span multiple utility service territories. Identifying the indirect benefits of a transmission project, such as congestion relief to particular customers, may be easier within an RTO. And then transmission planning. Northern Grid, as Commissioner Tony reviewed earlier, works with FERC jurisdictional utilities to meet their transmission planning compliance obligations, provide common data, and a single stakeholder forum. One commenter, however, described Northern Grid's planning process as, quote, a long staple that collates individual transmission plans rather than providing a regional view and optimization of transmission. Lack of transmission development since 2012, despite utilities identifying it as a reliability need, is evidence that, quote, the status quo for transmission planning is not working. Optimization. The optimization of existing resources in an RTO could delay or avoid the regional need to plan and build some transmission projects, but the impacts could vary significantly depending on the size of the region. Non-wires, an RTO transmission planning process should evaluate non-wire solutions. Congestion charges, depending on how an RTO is designed, congestion price signals can be an important tool to identify the need to plan for additional transmission. Given significant barriers to transmission development, including siting and permitting, an RTO transmission planning effort likely requires a 20-year planning horizon. Note about path capacity. Transitioning from a contract to a flow-based methodology for calculating ATC may identify more available transmission in the transmission planning process. An expansion, one commenter suggested an RTO could be designed to attract investors to develop interregional projects identified by a regional planning process. Best practices, regional transmission planning should evaluate transmission projects as multi-value projects with a broad range of benefits, incorporate a least regrets evaluation of risk when assessing new investments, and determine cost allocation on the basis of total benefits across the entire portfolio. And I think this is the last topic we have here, legacy transmission rights. As previously noted in our first meeting, a commenter raised the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which prevents the forced conversion of existing physical transmission rights to financial rights. Comparison to other RTOs. While other RTOs have addressed legacy rights, this could be more complicated in the Northwest due to the manner in which BPA markets the output from the Federal Columbia River Power System as a single system. And some transmission customers have designated that resource, that power system as their network resource. One commenter noted, however, that this type of conversion is, quote, a known process that can achieve beneficial results, even though there may be challenges in conversion. And a mitigation measure, it was noted that when a portion of WAPA joined SPP, it set aside transmission used to serve its preference customers to shield them from transmission rate impacts from joining the RTO. And multiple commenters note that without more specific details, it would be impossible to evaluate whether conversion of legacy transmission rights would be a net benefit to Oregonians. So that was a lot of me talking. Hopefully we can get some conversation here. I reviewed a lot of material there. So again, I'll reiterate the kind of standard questions I'm going to ask on each one of these topics. Do you support or oppose a particular perspective? Would you emphasize something differently? Is there something missing? That's sort of a first catch-all question. And then I have a couple of other questions I have here built off of the feedback, the comments. Incremental approaches to regionalization seem to focus more on energy markets and RA. That's my editorial comment. How much urgency is there to further integrate regional transmission planning? So I know that comment came up that maybe there's more that could be done on transmission planning regionally. And then legacy transmission rights. Certainly the voluntary nature of it is critical, but wondering if any thought or can you describe what it would take to consider voluntarily converting those rights to financial rights, or is there a process or steps, or what does that framework for analysis look like? So with that, I will look for feedback and input on any or all of these questions, or one that I haven't asked here, or anything else you saw on the screen.
Hey, Adam, this is Nicole.
Sure.
In the topic of something missing, I didn't see a discussion of pancaked rates. And I don't know, maybe if that's dealt with elsewhere.
So if you recall, the previous question was on transmission rates. We had a discussion of that at our first meeting. It didn't show up in this one, because I think most commenters put that discussion in the responses to the previous question, or question 5.
Okay. I mean, I do think it's still relevant to this overall transmission planning concept. I mean, another thing I'd like to hear others' feedback on is, you know, we in all the IRPs that we look at, we see issues related to transmission, lack of transmission, transmission congestion. There's really no solution to solve those right now. I mean, near term, there could be some efforts at BPA to work towards working with utilities in the region to relieve some of the requirements to move, you know, more ATC, and maybe relieve some of the requirements on conditional firm to help move more energy around. But long term, there is no solution to this. And so I think transmission is actually going to become the driving factor in states like Oregon meeting their 100% clean goals soon. And so I see the benefit of moving towards coordinated regional transmission planning as a way to really narrow in on where exactly the transmission congestion issues are, and then also have a regional cost allocation process for funding the relief of those transmission congestion. I don't see any new transmission being built in our region in the near term, other than those projects that have been planned and are sort of sitting in the process for years, unless we can get agreement that these projects are important on a regional basis. So I'd like to hear what others think about that.
Yeah, Nicole, this is Frank. I actually think the transmission is the key to make this whole thing work. And I would agree with everything you said. I would say that the benefits are not limited to Oregon. They're limited to they're for the whole region. And it seems like there are a number of utilities who recognize this as a bottleneck, but they're waiting for someone else to make a move, or they're, you know, it's I think a colleague of mine described it as sort of utility chicken, you know, who's going to make the first move. And it does seem like there's so many complexities to this, and just based on the roster of things, Adam, that you just presented, there's a whole bunch that goes into this, but it's really, really important to facilitate the investments, to optimize the operation, so that we can move to a more renewable portfolio across the region. If we want to leverage the diversity across the region, you have to be able to effectively interconnect it. And right now, there's not enough momentum moving that direction just on our own as utilities. And so, especially, you know, you look at this and appreciate Commissioner Tani's recognition that there's 30 plus BAs all kind of doing their own thing when we're trying to leverage the diversity of a region. So this is incredibly important. There's a lot of complexity to it, but I would say that if Oregon, Washington, if we all want to get where we need to go from a grid perspective, this particular issue is probably number one from my perspective.
And Frank, do you follow-up question there? So that's irrespective of an RTO, I assume, right? RTO or not, all right, that need exists.
Yeah, and I think what an RTO can do is, first of all, can provide better visibility as to the priorities to make that happen, which then can facilitate the investments and equitably share that cost and benefit across the region. Without that, it's too distributed, and as individuals, we probably don't always see those returns, or even understand the complete picture. So I think an RTO provides the visibility and hopefully the motivation and the return on the investments to make it happen. I think Nicole's right. You don't see a lot of sort of new investments, even though we all recognize there's this constraint. So I think an RTO really stimulates that.
Any other comments on that thought? I know it's a big topic of discussion. Also, I just want to, while you're thinking about that, remind everyone, and this is something I probably should have put on my slides here, but seeing Representative Marsh is a good reminder for me that let's think also, as we're thinking about how to respond to these questions of how to provide input that's of value to the legislature, right? What are the kind of issues that would be helpful for them to better understand? Because to the extent we talk about them here, we can elevate and highlight those in our report back to the legislature at the end of the year. So
Adam, this is Kathy. So one of the things, excuse me, I wanted to point out too is that, you know, as an entity who has been trying to build transmission for quite a while, you know, with B2H, I think one of the things to remember too is that regardless of the transmission planning process, you know, I think an RTO would be, you know, as pointed out, it would be more transparent. But you still have those hurdles such as permitting and siting and NEPA and all of those other things that actually, I think, from Idaho Power standpoint, makes getting this transmission built maybe even more complex than a potential cost allocation, because you can, you know, show a need, you know, to your regulators and get that going and moving from an IRP perspective. But what really tends to hold things up tends to be a lot of that other governmental red tape in the siting and the permitting processes. So I don't know what Oregon can do about that specifically, but I think, that we have to keep in mind that the RTO is not the ultimate, solution to getting transmission built. We personally at Idaho Power feel like transmission is the key to unlocking the clean energy future that all of us need. We've just got to have those pipelines to be able to move the power. But it really is a lot of that other stuff than just the group of the willing, right? I think we have some group of the willings. It's just some of those other processes that really bog you down.
So Kathy, Frank, Nicole, or anyone else on this topic, and maybe it's a little off topic from RTOs, but are there any best practices out there in this regard that you see from other parts of the country that you would highlight for us, or that you think we should be aware of? Or
Are you asking related to the siting issues?
to the siting and just all of these the transmission barriers that have been identified here?
I mean, we have a very unique situation in Oregon and the West in general as it relates to siting and permitting. Some of the barriers that we experience here, we don't experience in other regions. That said, we also have an agreed upon higher expectation for environmental protection and equity and cultural resources, important things that we have to balance here. So I'm not going to say there's a good model out there on these issues that we should look at. I do think, and I'm wondering, I totally agree with what Kathy's saying here. Like Oregon has some siting issues that we have to address. That's something that Renewable Northwest has been, trying to push on for years. But I wonder the benefit of having, a regional conversation around like this right here, this particular project, whatever it is so important, not just to Oregon, but to the region. If that helps push the needle on moving some of these projects through some difficult permitting processes. I mean, I think that there's when it becomes not just important for one utility and one utility's ratepayers, I think there's a little bit more push behind getting it done. Maybe I'm wrong.
This is Mary. I would just kind of add on a little bit to what Kathy was saying. PacifiCorp obviously, working for many years to get significant transmission built, and I think there are a lot of challenges that I think are separate from RTOs in terms of like what Kathy was saying, siting, and in the West we have also a lot more public lands. That can be a real challenge as well to kind of navigate those issues. I think, though, we look at the benefit of an RTO really to have kind of a coordinated space to try to conduct the transmission planning. I don't think it's a panacea in terms of cost allocation necessarily, because I think you still have a lot of horse trading around sort of how costs get allocated and how that works. But I also think that there is a benefit in terms of, from a jurisdictional perspective, that you have kind of a FERC home for making decisions around transmission and transmission rates, instead of kind of a very sort of balkanized approach that we have now, with each state really not in a bad way, but each state needing to take its own kind of local interests in mind that can kind of preempt or be prioritized over a broader regional interest. So I do think RTO kind of puts it in a regional context as opposed to kind of the sort of state by state context that we have now.
I wanted to lay a finer point on that. I agree with all of the comments so far, and I'm certainly a big believer in the benefits of transmission, but for purposes of laying out the pros and cons associated with these choices for this work, one of the functions of the RTO is to federalize the decision-making around transmission projects that are going to get built for the RTO footprint. And that, although that is a stakeholder process, it is ultimately in the hands of the market operator to decide what projects are going to get forward, at least based on today's construct and who it will be built by, who can then rate base those projects. And that's not necessarily the entity that proposes the project. That's today's construct. I recognize that FERC is actively asking a lot of questions about what that should look like going forward. But when the market operator makes that choice and that project goes forward, generally speaking, again, based on the constructs that exist in RTOs today, the word benefit is interpreted very broadly and is interpreted really on the theory that one element, facility, that might be built by the RTO and it might happen to be in one or two states because of its high voltage, bulk support, reliability support, whatever the metric is, it's going to benefit all the customers potentially of that footprint. So you're going to see Oregon customers being required to fund through a federal FERC jurisdictional tariff that the states aren't going to have a lot of ability to do something different. Those customers are going to pay for that asset. Now, I believe that assets on a bulk network system benefit all users. I don't really care what state the asset is in, but historically in our region, even based on a non-RTO world, that has been sometimes a difficult pill to swallow for some states. PacifiCorp, sorry, Mary, it's a great example because of your broad footprint. You know, you've built bulk assets in the Utah area in your history with Energy Gateway, and that should be a cost spread by in the entire network of all the states that are part of that networked grid that operates to serve those customers. But historically, that has not always gone smoothly in every state where those assets have been placed into rates. Now, we don't have a FERC jurisdictional RTO tariff, so you have to argue at FERC and you have to argue in each state to get cost recovery for those assets. So in that sense, RTO is attractive to someone who would like to see transmission built because it will take some of the state dialogue and debate out of the arena. And I just want to be very clear about that because we have stakeholders here who represent state interests, but that is one of the pro-con consequences of moving in this direction.
This is a great discussion.
And just one more thing to add to kind of pile on to what Sarah's saying. I do think that it doesn't mean that the states are completely removed from the conversation, but then that it emphasizes that governance structure where the states have the ability to participate and weigh in, but in a different way. And I think also, you know, for PacifiCorp, you know, our system doesn't really have a governance structure. You know, we actually kind of are a mini RTO, honestly, our little system. But we don't really have a governance structure. And so from our perspective, I think an RTO is attractive because it's not just, you know, sort of taking away states' jurisdiction and putting it in FERC. It's really creating a format and a structure to enable decision-making and process different perspectives from different states kind of in a FERC context. In a much more formal way than anything we have now. We don't have, there's no, not just for PacifiCorp, but kind of across the West, there's not kind of a true forum to kind of have those regional conversations actually lead to decision-making.
Mary's exactly right. I just wanted to put it out there. There is some jurisdictional consequence, but it just shifts. The conversation shifts to the FERC jurisdictional arena, where typically in RTOs, states are given a range of authorities when it comes to transmission cost allocation, but it's all inside of that FERC jurisdictional governance structure.
So I apologize. I see, I was just told that Oriana had her hand up on the chat, which I somehow don't have visibility to. So someone just flagged it for me. So I want to go to Oriana next and then Commissioner Tawney. And we're running behind schedule, but this is a really good conversation and an important topic that cuts across a lot of our topics. So I think we're good to keep going. So Oriana and then Commissioner Tawney.
Thanks. I'd just like to start with a process request, which is you started this meeting by talking about bringing some of the DEI conversations to process. I would not describe the way this conversation has played out as good process in terms of keeping stack and holding space for other voices. I've had my hand up for quite some time now to raise some environmental justice concerns, and it feels like that's kind of been tamped down. I'm sorry to be really salty, but if there's some way to keep stack and have a little bit more order than just people jumping in, that tends to really silence the voices of people who are really trying to listen and really values the voices of people who are not necessarily listening to understand, which is not to say that folks are not doing that in this space, but just having been in a lot of different spaces that use different kinds of forms of allowing for folks to speak, I think really valuing listening is important in this conversation. And so maybe asking folks to take a pause before jumping in, and also just keeping an eye on the chat and hands raised for folks who are trying to be a little bit more patient and process information. So sorry to be grumpy, but just want to name that from a good process perspective. Now to the comment I was hoping to make. This goes back a little earlier in the conversation, so sorry if it's taking us back. But I think one of the really big concerns that comes up from an environmental justice perspective about an RTO, and I think it's really played out in this conversation, is just the demand for new transmission that may come up, regardless of whether it happens at more of the state level, or I think as Nicole was saying, that we need this regional approach to relieve transmission congestion. We don't dispute that by any means, but I think there are a lot of siting issues associated with transmission that come up for communities. And we've seen that with B2H, a lot of opposition from community. And the historical cultural resources impacts, the community impacts, the impacts on agricultural communities from any kind of siting. We don't want to see things be overly burdensome that prevent things from happening, but we also need good process that protects communities and allows for good intervention. So I think that that's something we'd really hope ODA would register, is just that tension between the need for new transmission, but also the need to do it in a way that is just and doesn't do harm to communities or shut communities out of processes. I think we'd also really like to see the ways in which new transmission and even an RTO can value community-based resources and distributed generation as well, either as an alternative from a balancing perspective, to avoid some of the need for that really large transmission. If you don't need to move power longer distances, that can help with transmission congestion if there's more load that's actually served by generation near that load. But also to find ways to ensure that when new transmission gets built, the capacity doesn't get eaten up so quickly that you can't have more community-based projects. For example, a community solar project that might want to move generation from Lake County to the Willamette Valley. So I think that's a consideration as well, is that even if new transmission is getting built, that it's not precluding some of the more community-based resources in favor of larger scale generation. And just generally the issue and importance of ensuring that siting happens in a just way and that an RTO doesn't drive a lot of new transmission development that does harm to communities.
Thank you, Oriana, and thanks for the process reminder. I have to apologize. We're not familiar with this platform. We usually use Teams, and I just figured out how to find the full list and see the hand raising. So I see now we also have other hands raised. So I think that's a good suggestion. I would like us to use that going forward. If it's not intuitive to those attending, let us know, and Linda can provide a direction on how to raise your hand there. But so first I'll go to Commissioner Tony though, and then I see the two hands on the chat, Spencer and Fred.
Thanks so much. And Oriana, that's an entirely appropriate process reminder. And please just call me Lisa in this forum. I would just highlight from my perspective the tension that Mary and Sarah raised and that Oriana is pointing to a nuance on state policy versus the federal jurisdiction, and the challenge and the potential benefits of moving conversations to a regional space with federal oversight. Part of how you manage that tension is by ensuring governance that has state representation really front and center and well balanced with the other parties in the RTO. And you see MISO having handled that in one way, you see SPP having handled that in another way. There's a lot of structural ways to accomplish that, but I think if you don't have effective engagement by state policymakers in the RTO, that tension becomes really corrosive over time because you can't address state concerns, whether they're environmental justice concerns or they're cost allocation concerns or anything else that the state policy environment wants to center. And that's different in other states, right? Wyoming and Utah have other state policies that they want to center. And if you don't bring that conversation forward in a really effective way in the RTO, it becomes really corrosive to being able to make progress on all of these important issues in the RTO, and the RTO simply becomes very locked up. So as we're thinking about advice to the legislature and thinking about these trade-offs, I would suggest part of the way the state manages this is by advocating for a state policymaker role that is effective in the RTO construct. And I'll leave it there. I look forward. This is a really productive conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Letha. And certainly some of those threads will come up in our question 10 on governance. So let's see here. We have Spencer next, then Fred, then Mike, then Robbie. So Spencer.
Thanks, Adam. I wanted to respond in part to Oriana's last comment about being mindful of transmission expansion impacts on local communities. One thing that is easy to sort of skip over in an RTO conversation is as you think through what a different transmission planning function could look like in an RTO is in the actual operations of an RTO, in optimizing the existing transmission, you are sucking out as much value as you can from the existing grid in a way that helps you put off and avoid building a bunch of transmission that if you look at the existing grid now without a central market operator, you might overbuild. And so I think spotlighting that function of an RTO, which lasts as long as you have an RTO, is really important to think about how to best use the existing lines that we already have, as well as identifying congestion points so you can more pinpoint where upgrades to the existing grid would make sense before you actually go about building a whole new line segment. So I wanted to add that point about really a value proposition for optimizing the existing grid before you get to new construction. Adam, you asked if there were good examples from other parts of the country, the sort of best practices for the transmission planning function of RTOs. And I think there are some that would be worth highlighting for the legislature. I'm a little hesitant to bring Texas into this conversation, but I do want to spotlight one good thing that Texas did about 15 years ago with the Competitive Renewable Energy Zone program. This was a program to develop transmission within Texas by identifying the places with the highest wind potential and figuring out where the best places to optimize new lines would be from those places to the big cities in central and southern Texas. That was a largely successful effort that built new transmission where it was needed to facilitate a lot of new wind development. What it didn't do was build transmission to other parts of the country and adjacent states that would have avoided the blackout that Texas experienced this winter. But it is worth spotlighting within a big area within Texas that did sort of optimize transmission planning. Another good example is MISO's multi-value projects. The Midwest ISO ran a process that covered, unlike Texas, multiple states beginning 9 or 10 years ago, again, focused on accessing new wind resources and the other things that transmission can provide to the grid. So those two examples are ways that if an RTO formed in the Northwest or the broader West, you could see a more, I think, effective and in some cases competitive process for planning and procuring transmission. And the final point I guess I wanted to make is I think it's worth keeping in mind and perhaps spotlighting for the legislature that the way we build our existing grid in the Northwest, where Bonneville has 3/4 of the circuit miles of lines, Bonneville's often been the sort of builder of first resort for the region in the last 100 years. That has become increasingly a difficult role for Bonneville to play. And I know Ravi's here and maybe wants to comment on this, but having a federal agency with capital to build lines has been sort of a blessing for the region to have a lot of extra capacity lying around. That doesn't seem to be a role that Bonneville is as able to play now, whether it's a combination of its current commercial position, challenges with fish passage issues, or just the fact that it has a lot of debt now and it's less willing to increase its leverage. The way we've done things in the past to build out transmission is probably not the way we're going to be able to do it going forward. So the solutions we relied on for the last 100 years aren't as available to us.
Thank you, Spencer. We'll go to Fred next, and I'll note again, we're certainly over time on the agenda, but I think we'll make it up on some of the other questions. I had a sneaking suspicion that there's going to be more discussion on these questions than our last meeting, and so far I'm right. Fred.
So, and this discussion could go on for quite a while longer, and but I think if we're focusing on what views to provide to the legislature, I'll just mention a couple. First is an RTO, the generic concept, offers one big thing for me, which is harmonization across a whole range of issues having to do with transmission. At the operational level, just day to day, minute to minute. At the planning level, in integrating across a bigger footprint to optimize both new transmission, expansion, but also, and I think this is undervalued right now, but it's pretty significant, the expanding the capability of the existing system. So through, the current phrase du jour, which I really don't like, grid enhancing technologies gets, just as one example. And yes, the utilities in Bonneville are doing a lot of that already, but, you get a benefit by making it, harmonizing that across a wider footprint. And then also on not just the planning, but also cost allocation. And really, the RTO, at least in concept, provides us the ability to decide what gets built. So you don't have planning over here in the Order 1000 planning region, in our case, Northern Grid, and the implementation over there with the balancing authorities or other transmission developers. So that, at least in theory, that is the way it should work. In practice, I think there's a big divide between single state RTOs like Texas, and I think Spencer was right to point out the CREZ development process there is a big success, and the multi-state RTO, the 3 state RTOs are California, New York, and Texas. Oregon is not those states. We are not going to be a single state RTO. And the multi-state RTOs have integrated planning and so forth, but they run into a couple of issues, one of which is state interest. We really see this in MISO in particular, where the MVP process worked pretty well for a cycle, but hasn't really gone forward. And I think in part, when new transmission started to get built, you started seeing different state interest emerging, a lot of opposition in some states to new long lines that other states really wanted. And that's not even to get into all the inter RTO issues as well. So I just say, yes, an RTO could offer a lot of advantages for transmission, but there are going to be some difficulties that we have to wrestle with. Maybe the second point I want to make is about unavoidably, we have to talk about the situation with Bonneville. Bonneville is not just a transmission owner, which they are. They also operate an integrated system, as Spencer also pointed out. And that system, like all of the West, except for the ISO, operates under a contract-based approach, not a flow-based approach. Now, I think it's easy to say, well, in RTO, you can move to a flow-based approach. It's all going to be great. But that really, we have to look at Bonneville as a unique institution with a really important role in trying to move from a contract-based approach to a flow-based approach, given Bonneville's integrated approach, is going to be a big issue to have to unravel and kind of piece together where, how you do that transmission. It's not just a matter of grandfathering rights and that sort of thing. The Bonneville system has some unique features that we have to consider in the transition to an RTO process. So I just wanted to say those two things. There's lots more, obviously, we could talk about.
Thank you, Fred. And there certainly is. We could probably do this topic all day and come back tomorrow. We'll go to Mike and then Ravi, and those are the only hands I'm seeing at the moment. And then, while we could keep this going, I'd like to move on to the next topic, just so we can cover some other material. We could always come back to this at the end if there's time. Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I'll try to keep these comments brief because I know we're running short, and a lot of what I was going to say was actually covered by Spencer and Fred, so I appreciate the comments there. But really, I just wanted to make some kind of high-level comments about, like, what is it we'd like to show to the legislature that, an RTO can provide, and really that it's that it can provide benefits to Oregon customers. And I think transmission planning is a key piece in which benefits can accrue and flow through to Oregon customers. And I think the hope, in a well-planned and well-functioning RTO is that you'd actually be able to optimize existing transmission rather than kind of build out new transmission. So Spencer, I appreciate your thoughts there and kind of looking at some best practices from other areas. Yeah, I think it also comes down to putting strong side rails, and we can speak about this more in the governance conversation, but having a strong governance structure in place that ensures kind of, voices are equally considered from throughout the footprint because, the RTO will have kind of like a central hub for transmission planning. And I think, within that transmission planning, I think ideally we would get to a place where, we can look at the transmission that's kind of across the footprint and then use that to then decide which resources, if new resources are going to be procured, which would be kind of the most cost effective to fit within that existing transmission footprint, which is kind of a flip of the current paradigm, which is, that happens to an extent in utility resource planning, but right now the prevailing paradigm seems to be more, okay, let's find a resource that best complements our existing resource stack, and then find a way to get the electrons from, say, Montana or Wyoming wind back to the Northwest. So yeah, basically, I think at a high level, I think that RTOs can provide a lot of promise. I think it comes down to governance. I think if we have kind of a good governance structure with a central transmission planning entity, hopefully we can really optimize the system. And I think that's the way that we can get benefits back. So I think kind of laying that down at a high level to the legislature would be helpful.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks for bringing that back to the legislative focus. Ravi, and then we'll move on to question number 7 on renewables.
Thanks, Adam, and thank you. Some really, really great conversation and great inputs that have already been said and provided. So it's kind of taken away my punchline. So I guess waiting long enough actually worked in this case. Couple of quick points that I want to make. I fully agree with the point about strong governance structure in place, but I want to add on to it that when writing this report, also to consider market structure, market design and operation. That is probably also key to the overall success of an RTO. Now, said that, I think what we need to really, I fully agree, number one, that coordination amongst a larger set of groups and a transmission footprint on a broad geographical footprint does provide the opportunity to have optimization of the transmission bill based on a much broader collective need. Definitely. But re-emphasize that whether you have an RTO or you don't have an RTO, the permitting challenges and the policies around it are still going to remain. So that, again, reinforce and re-emphasize that doesn't change whether you go to an RTO or you don't go to an RTO. The point around whether Bonneville, there was a lot of comments made around Bonneville, and I agree to some of them. But in the last decade, and we are reaching a saturation point, if you're talking about next 20 years or so, there may not be as much system capacity left. But since 2012, or even a little before that, Bonneville has built several transmission lines, has reinforced the system, has enabled over 7,000 megawatt of clean energy resources, has done optimized risk-based planning to avoid building over $1 billion project along the I-5 corridor, but at the same time also come up with some creative mechanisms to offer conditional firm. And our conditional firm has been working fairly good this year. This year itself, we offered more than 1.5 gigawatt of conditional firm service. The challenge that we're still missing, and we're missing the point, is it's not so much on the transmission network that you're facing the challenge. The challenge that Bonneville faces and the RTO will face also is on the localized grid. When you have renewables and the generation trying to interconnect on 69 and 115 kV system, where the system was never built to integrate hundreds and thousands of megawatts, it requires major reinforcement along those points. Renewable trying to come on the coastal side, the system there was built as a delivery system to the load, but never as a supply side. So key things to remember is that the transmission planning has worked. It may not be situated well enough to deal for the next 20, 30 years out in the future for various reasons already noted. But transmission planners and planning has done fairly well. But the challenges are more not on the network, but more on the localized grid. And the other thing is that I want to point out is that we always plan the system based on a 10-year planning horizon. And the build of a transmission takes longer than 10 years for all the points that have already been made. However, if you start planning based on a longer planning horizon, as FERC has been pushing for in their NOPR, it presents a new challenge. If we have to plan for 30 years, and had we done that 30-year planning 30 years back, we would have been building for gas projects, not for renewables. We would have made investments in gas projects, transmission lines to enable gas energy to the loads, which would have been in different parts of the system than where the markets are going, or where the future is going towards clean energy. So we have to generate a balance. We can't just blindly say that the transmission planning is broken and RTO will solve it. We have to realize that there are a multitude of complexity that rests within the planning process. And the planning process is not just the only thing. If you look at the full value chain, it's the planning, it's the permitting, it's the designing and the cost associated with the designing and construction, and having a reliable operation. You have to look at the full value chain, and you have to balance it across not just the supply side, which is where a lot of the focus remains. You have to balance it against the demand side and make sure that the demand is there. If the demand is for 6 gigawatts, you're not going to plan on the supply side for 60 gigawatts, because that imbalance will create a lot of transmission and a lot of stranded investment and extremely high rates. So the balance is what the key message that I want to communicate. Rest, I think Spencer made some really good points, and so did Fred and others. So I will not repeat those. But thank you.
All right, thank you, Ravi, and everyone. So I'll give, I want to move on with the agenda, but I'll give one last opportunity. If you have a brief response to any of the last few comments, particularly those who haven't had a chance to speak up yet, give you a moment now to speak up before we move on. And while we're waiting there for a moment, we've had Amira Streeter from the governor's office join us, as well as Mary Pleasant from DEQ. I'm not sure if either wants to introduce themselves, but feel free to take a moment to say hello.
Yes, I'll go ahead and jump in. Thank you, Adam. Hi, everyone. My name is Amira Streeter. I'm the new Climate, Energy, and Transportation Policy Advisor. Happy to be here this morning. Sorry for being late. I had a couple of technical difficulties, but I've been here for the majority of the discussion. Very good discussion. As I step into this role, I'm sure I will have to learn a lot, and I really appreciate everyone giving their perspective. And I'll have to leave at 10 a.m. today, but looking forward to joining you in the future for these meetings.
Great, thank you for joining us.
Hi, I'm Mary Pleasant. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I joined earlier by phone and couldn't figure out during roll call how to jump in. So anyways, I'm here, and this has really been, I feel like I'm more in the learning seat here, so some of these presentations early on have been really, really helpful for me to frame the context. And yeah, anyways, I appreciate being able to listen in.
Great. Glad you could join us. All right. Well, thank you all. That was a great discussion. Lots of good information there. Now let's move on to question number 7 on renewables. So again, similar to the last discussion, really asked a question here about implications on how renewable development from RTO formation would be or would not be preferable to the status quo. A lot of different sort of subtopics here around types and locations of renewables, PURPA implications, distributed energy resources, manufacturing potential, and Oregon jobs. So I'll run through these again real quick and get us to the discussion slide. General feedback, so state policy. State policy will likely drive significant new development of clean energy resources with or without an RTO. I think we all see that. Transmission access. One commenter described transmission access as a significant barrier to the development of some renewables, and an RTO could help by sharing the cost of new transmission necessary to bring renewables to load. Resource agnostic. This came up from multiple commenters about the need for a well-run RTO to be resource agnostic and objectively value the energy and non-energy attributes that a resource can deliver. Reduced curtailments. Commenters expected that an RTO would ensure fewer renewable resources are curtailed. Geographic diversity. A regional RTO should allow Oregon customers to benefit more from high-quality renewable resource areas, such as wind in the Intermountain states. Adverse impacts. One commenter identified a potential cost burden on Oregon customers that could accrue from, quote, many small renewable facilities adversely impacting system operations. You know what I'll do here? I will try to keep an eye on the hand raise function since I've now found it. If you have a burning feedback on a particular item here before we get to the discussion slide, feel free to shoot your hand up and I will call on you.
Adam, I just have a question about the adverse impacts that could accrue from many small renewable facilities. Is that like if Oregon Utilities join an RTO, there could be an impact from many small renewable facilities? I'm not really understanding what the concern is.
You know, I believe that was the concern that was being conveyed.
I'm wondering if the impact is that there's a lot of small projects instead of big ones and that would cost more, or if this is a siting concern or issue.
I'm not sure if anyone on the committee wants to speak to that issue. We can also note it for later, and I can.
Okay.
We can bring it up in the discussion. Types and locations of renewables, offshore wind. So this was brought up by several commenters. Belief that an RTO would benefit the development of Oregon's offshore wind resource, which will require significant investment in generation and transmission, and identified at least one recent technical study that found the same. Solar, RTO formation may impact solar development, but different views were shared on this. One view, Oregon has vast solar resources in parts of the state that are currently underserved by IOU transmission systems that could benefit from increased access enabled by an RTO. But another view was that RTO formation would likely result in less solar being developed in Oregon. I think the argument there being that stronger solar resources in other parts of the West would instead be developed in lieu of Oregon solar. No impact. Other commenters suggested that RTO formation would be unlikely to impact the types of renewables developed in Oregon. And location, the location of renewable development can be significantly impacted by transmission access or lack thereof, and the cost of that transmission on customers is an important consideration. An RTO may identify the most efficient upgrades needed to deliver renewables. PURPA, lots of feedback on PURPA implications. Multiple commenters flagged FERC Order 872 that recently lowered the mandatory purchase obligation on utilities for renewable QFs from 20 to 5 megawatts, but also noted that the basis for this change was that non-discriminatory market access afforded by an RTO energy markets and that this is something critical consideration during RTO design. Existing QFs, a note about this that came up by multiple commenters. The utilities have existing legally enforceable obligations to purchase power from some QFs, and that would continue. Those agreements would be honored for their duration, irrespective of RTO formation. Retail rates. One utility commenter asserted that it currently pays, quote, far more for generation from PURPA projects than for average market purchases, such that limitations on utility QF obligations from joining RTO would, quote, be advantageous for Oregon customer rates. And some more on PURPA. Disaggregated QF projects. Again, another commenter cautioned that RTO formation, quote, would incentivize QFs to disaggregate to avoid limitations on utility purchase obligations for renewable sized greater than 5 megawatts. GHG tracking. And again, this will come up later. It's more explicitly question about GHG in the next question. But HB 2021 excludes PURPA QFs from determining a retail electricity provider's overall emissions for compliance with clean energy targets. As a result, RTO formation would not likely have a significant impact in this regard. Streamline development. The QF purchase limitation on renewables size more than 5 megawatts would streamline the development process, increase competition, and ease the administrative burden on utilities and stakeholders. Then switch topics here to distributed energy resources. General comment, New York and California each operate RTOs and are widely viewed as states with the most successful DER programs, able to pair RTOs with supportive legislation and mandates. Again, resource agnostic came up in this context. The RTO market should be agnostic towards specific resources, and as such should fairly compensate DERs for the value of energy capacity and grid services provided. Work order 2222, always want to make sure I get the right number of twos there, requires RTOs to adopt market rules to allow for aggregated DERs to bid into energy markets as a single resource. One commenter suggests that a Northwest RTO could identify best practices in CAISO and PJM and consult with PNNL to, quote, proactively facilitate the integration of DERs. System impacts. One commenter notes the potential for DERs to impact the grid in, quote, unanticipated ways due to the decentralized location of these resources, and proposes centralized control of DERs that are responsive to prices set by market principles as a way to mitigate these impacts. And no impacts. Another commenter suggests that few DERs would rise to the level of any RTO impacts at all. And this is the last subtopic here on manufacturing and jobs benefits. Multiple commenters expect that an RTO would result in a net benefit to Oregon jobs, something that was also found in the literature. An increased opportunity for construction jobs to build renewables in state was identified. RTOs can facilitate corporate renewable purchases, which further supports additional renewable development jobs, and as many commenters suggested, may help encourage more corporations to locate in Oregon. Again, this uncertainty issue was raised, right? That without specific market design, it's hard to really evaluate this question. In-state requirements, multiple commenters voiced opposition to any state-specific job requirements on the basis that utility ratepayers should not subsidize economic development, and that any effort by Oregon to do this would likely prompt other states to do the same. And now we get to discussion questions. So the usual question there first, do you support or oppose something? Would you emphasize something differently? Is there something missing? I'll make a note here to raise your hand on the raise hand function while I read my other two questions here. So two other questions that I'm throwing out here that I came up with based on some of the feedback. So one on DERs. Multiple commenters offered support for resource agnostic energy markets. Are there any particular concerns about how other RTOs are designed that would disadvantage certain resources like DERs? Or does FERC Order 2222 sufficiently address this? And another question on manufacturing. This was just an interesting one to me. I thought, many commenters identified offshore wind developments as likely driven by an RTO in Oregon. But then at the same time, commenters suggested an RTO shouldn't be viewed as a tool to support in-state manufacturing. But based on the nature of offshore wind, curious to what extent committee members think RTO formation would indirectly support in-state manufacturing related to offshore wind, which is a very manufacturing intensive industry, and it's certainly of interest to the south coast of Oregon. So I see Fred Hewitt has his hand raised. So we'll take Fred first.
Yeah, obviously a lot that could be said about all these issues. I'll keep it really brief and only really address two issues. The DER issue is, I would observe, especially from the Eastern RTOs, there can be imbalance. I don't know actually how to describe it. I don't want to say discrimination, has lots of overlays to it, but some types of resources can be disadvantaged, maybe a better way to say it, based on market rules. And this is a really pretty significant issue, especially for demand response, but also I think for renewables in some cases. A lot of it is tied to the resource adequacy construct in a particular RTO and the rules around qualifying for RA or even being able to, for example, in a forward capacity market, the rules may in effect create hurdles or even barriers for resources to participate, to bid in, to be selected. So there's all of those kinds of issues. And I think on the, kind of the normal day ahead, real-time dispatch level, resources that, can be bid in, and, they dispatch how they do it. So I think there is, there are some issues there to consider. The other issue I want to briefly just mention is PURPA. I've looked I'm certainly no expert on this, and I'm not a FERC in the FERC bar or anything like that. The section 210M, which is the kind of the source of all this, as well as several FERC orders. The issue I find there is if you look around the RTOs for a discussion about how smaller resources that would be PURPA resources are participating in those markets, I don't hear anything. What has happened is, especially with wind, because wind is really, the bigger you go, the more economic it is. The small wind, it doesn't seem to be happening. And I don't really think small solar is either. And this is a policy issue for the state, in my view. I've always felt, going way back, that Oregon should promote renewables at every scale, because there's lots of reasons to do that. Community development, resilience, diversity, across the landscape, and so on, that go beyond just the straight economic, are you a least cost resource at that moment on the grid or not? So I think this is something to consider, is if PURPA, I have other things to say about PURPA, but I really think there's a high value to having a diverse range of renewables in Oregon, in the state. And that is something to consider as if an RTO process goes forward, how can state policy continue to support that effectively? Thanks.
Thank you, Fred. I see Spencer has his hand raised next. Then I was going to ask Travis next if he's interested in speaking. I know he had several comments on this topic. Not to put you on the spot, Travis, but I'm curious to hear your feedback on some of these issues. So Spencer, take it away.
Thanks, Adam. I just wanted to strongly concur with the final slide that described an RTO formation leading to a stronger market signal for development of offshore wind in Oregon. Of course, it's possible to develop any number of new energy projects bilaterally, having a contract signed between two counterparties, with them figuring out the transmission rights in between the load and an offshore wind project. But I think overall, for full development in Oregon of the wind potential, having a regional market operated through an RTO is the best way to create a market signal for building offshore wind projects. And then the second comment I wanted to add is to maybe move up to a 20,000 foot level on the slides you had about PURPA and distributed energy resources. To me, the underlying value proposition for Oregon and other states in the West for those topics is open access. In the case of PURPA, for those who don't follow PURPA closely, PURPA is a law passed by Congress in 1978 that authorized renewable energy projects to have a right to interconnect and to sell power to utilities before any of these regional markets were created. In 2005, Congress declared that in an RTO, Congress is assuming there is open access for those projects to both interconnect to the market, to the grid, and to sell to consumers. And the basis of that decision by Congress was that where you have an independent operator of transmission, you're removing that incentive by a utility that owns the transmission to refuse to open their grid to access to generators other than themselves. That is the value proposition for renewables developers in general for having an RTO. And Congress recognized that fact in saying for PURPA projects in RTOs, the must purchase obligation that we go through trench warfare in the West about because we don't have an RTO, that no longer has to happen for larger QF projects. It's a little bit different for the smaller QF projects. And that value proposition holds true as much for DERs as well. In that case, it's less of a resistance by the utility transmission providers than the absence of an adequate platform in places without an RTO that an RTO provides. Thanks.
Thank you, Spencer. I don't see other hands raised.
Adam.
Now I see a real hand. I'm looking at my little digital hands here.
Sorry, I couldn't figure out how to do it. I'm new to this as well. The only other organization that I know that uses this is BPA. So, one other thing that I just want to say, first of all, I really appreciate Spencer laying that out. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, that the value proposition for an RTO does include this sort of non-discriminatory access to the system that we're hoping results in more renewables. I want to point out another thing that I think is important to bring up that's kind of missing from this is, we talked about jobs and, one common theme from RTOs is the presence of large commercial customers that procure clean energy. So these would be like your Facebooks and your Amazons and your Apples and the big data center companies that want to be able to procure renewables. And the reason they prefer being in an RTO region is they can procure renewables from a project anywhere within that system through a virtual power purchase agreement. That only can happen in our region through use of either green tariffs or modifications to existing tariffs that don't, and I may get some pushback from this, from folks on this call, but that really don't open up that opportunity to everyone. So the benefit of an RTO, one of the benefits of an RTO in this region is that corporations that want to set up shop, they want to build data centers, or they want to set their headquarters in a state that has access to renewables, would prefer to do so in an RTO because of that access. And so that is a potential benefit in terms of jobs, bringing more companies to our state for the access that they have of procuring these renewables through VPPAs that don't currently exist right now in Oregon. So I just want to point that out.
Thanks, Nicole. And I see Travis camera.
Yeah, you'd asked for a little bit of input, and so with renewables, I know we definitely are trying to move and embrace the renewables, especially with the offshore wind. That is something that I know is of interest to us. Again, I come down to creation of an RTO. Yeah, I would rather our renewables continue to work through our current platforms. I do see concern over these small renewable projects in the way that PURPA drags some of these utilities into access with these smaller projects. An RTO could make that even worse. I don't believe that every project should be built. There are things that advantage customers through the utility system, and every single renewable project is not something that's going to benefit customers just because it's a renewable project. So not every developer has the best interest of customers. A lot of developers have the best interest of making money off of their renewable platforms. And so I think the utilities do balance that load and assets and resources to try to best serve customers and the best value. And I don't know that those independent power producers are there to have that same shared goal.
Great. Thank you, Travis, for the feedback. I know Ravi had his hand up first, but I saw Ben. Let's go to Ben Aquila, and then we'll go to Ravi.
I just wanted to kind of say, as looking over some of these, a lot of them seem like they're issues that aren't necessarily related to RTO formulation fundamentally. And so I guess even in the last conversation, I feel like an RTO is a platform that enables kind of collective policy, enables either through legislation or through sort of agreement at an RTO level, you to do things about renewables. But I don't know that it necessarily implies each of these things would happen. I think a lot of people are thinking to specific examples of RTOs that may or may not have different policies. And I just don't think those are fundamental to the RTO. I think a lot of what we see here is concerns or fears about ways that RTOs have gone, but not necessarily implicit in developing one. So I guess I think an RTO is some of the things are absolutely fundamental. Reduction in curtailment, that is absolutely part of forming an RTO, and it's a huge advantage of it, and it's fundamental to it. A lot of things in this are just not related to an RTO per se, but related to subsequent decisions that are made at an RTO or by legislators or other policymakers that are setting forth the rules for the RTO. And so in a lot of ways, I think an RTO gives you options. And I think that's a huge value and something that should be highlighted. And I think there are some things that are inherent, but I think there's much of this that is not. And so I guess that was my main feedback.
Yeah, Ben, thank you for that feedback. That's something, a recurring theme, I think, in some of the comments are, uncertainty around how RTOs are designed and being able to evaluate things. So that's, I think, one key piece of kind of a lens to think about with feedback to the legislature around, are there certain discretionary things that we would like an RTO to do that they don't necessarily need to do, right? Are there certain priorities we have that we want to see, whether it's on governance or it's support for renewables or whatever it is? I think there's, it's not necessarily always inherently tied up with the RTO, but let's go to Ravi next, and then Mary Winkie.
Thanks, Adam, and thank you, Ben. I think you took my point away. That is exactly what I wanted to make as my main point and remark. One thing that I would like to add, when considering in your paper, providing your paper to the legislation, RTO definitely, could help increase the renewables, could help improve the market for renewables. But I think maybe my comment is more on Nicole's comment that, the Googles and the Apples and all the server farms, they want to site in an RTO because it gives them access to renewables. Northwest is not an RTO yet. It is a bilateral market, and yet we have seen hundreds and thousands of megawatts of these data server farms that have come into either Central Oregon or the Morrow County. UEC can probably vouch, and they're still growing. They're both the places, and we're not an RTO. The thing that what they're looking for is access to renewables and access to transmission, and I think we need to focus more on that part. At least I wouldn't comment on the manufacturing and the job proposition here. That it's not my place to make a comment on that. But in terms of getting access to renewables in an open environment. An RTO may be able to facilitate that, but again, it falls on the governance and how your market structure is and how your operation is. Transmission planning will continue to do what it does, whether it's in a bilateral market or whether it's in an RTO. The policies and the contractual rights, as someone, I think Fred had pointed out earlier, that may make it a little smoother and easier. Removal of pancake rates may make it easier versus where we are in the bilateral market. So I like things to be focused on the things that are going to be different in an RTO that cannot be accomplished under a bilateral market to show the value of it, rather than, what can be achieved in a bilateral market that we have today should not be highlighted as what the RTO gives, because you can still get it in today's market. And to what extent, I think we have seen in the last decade with the amount of integration that has happened. And if I recall correctly, Northwest Power Pool footprint has over 18 gigawatts of renewable that has been added on to the system. I'm not talking DP, I'm talking about the entire power pool footprint. That's a pretty significant amount that has been, and the number comes from the power pool, so I could be wrong here, but that's the number that they have come up with. However, one last point, Adam, and to the team here, when I made the comment on incrementalization, which we'll discuss at the later stage, one of the things that I want to mention when we talk about renewables is that the area that we need to focus is the development of Western Resource Adequacy Program with an effective coordination with our regional entities. EIM is there. We need to work on the Western Resource Adequacy and make that a success. What we learn from these programs will help form the base. And that's where and I don't want to take away the future discussion now, but that's where I was heading when I made the comment on incrementalization. All of these are great point of resource, renewable interconnection and access to renewables in the system. They're all great point. Transmission, complexities surrounding it, all great point. But doing it in an incremental approach gets you to a more success than trying to jump into an RTO, because I don't think any of this conversation has shown that there's absolutely a remarkable 180-degree turnaround benefit of an RTO versus what we have today. So I'll leave it at that for the next conversation.
Okay, thank you, Ravi, for that teaser. Mary.
Thank you. So I was going to make a comment, I think, kind of similar to what the point Ravi was making in terms of the problems that we're solving by joining an RTO, or kind of what an RTO can do in terms of solving problems that we currently have. And that I think it's really important to distinguish what we're solving for with an RTO versus what can be solved for separately from an RTO, or what types of problems exist kind of regardless of whether an RTO exists. I think in the transmission conversation, we're talking about siting. That's an example. And I think things like, thinking sort of about how and why corporate buyers site in particular regions, I think is really varied and has a lot of different variables. As Ravi notes, we've had a lot of data centers site here, primarily due to the low cost of energy. And so it just strikes me that you're thinking through, a utility kind of moving forward with the decision to join an RTO structure or not, really kind of looking at the costs and benefits of that move, in terms of kind of affordability and reliability at the same time. So I think from my perspective, the real benefit of an RTO from a renewables perspective is really in that kind of core function of integrating more seamlessly across a broader footprint. And I know we're getting this we'll get into this in the next question, but then I think that does create a lot of tension in terms of some of these individual state policies and making sure that those individual state policies are still reflected even while you are able to get that benefit through the RTO of increased integration. and avoid curtailment.
Thank you, Mary. I see some hands still raised. I don't know if these were in response to something that was said or if these were from earlier. Spencer, your hand is raised.
Thanks, Adam. I was just going to respond briefly to Robbie's comments and I guess clarify, at least from my comments, if it wasn't clear earlier, the problem that NIPSEA's identified is not that the Northwest can't or hasn't had development of new renewables on the existing grid. It's can we do it better and where do we go from here now that a lot of the existing renewable resource, particularly the wind in the Columbia River Gorge, has been tapped. How are we going to bring on offshore wind in Oregon? How are we going to integrate more wind in Montana and Wyoming, solar in Central Oregon, and everything in between? And so I don't want the group here to walk away with the impression that renewables developers and IPPs don't think the system works at all here. It does work to a degree, but the notion that we should just keep on trucking the way we're doing it, I think misses the possibility of doing things better. And for what it's worth, the members of NIPSEA are customer facing. They are talking to large corporations who are trying to build out their renewable resource portfolio. And it's harder to do it in the Northwest than other regions. The power can be cheaper in general. That's a good resource we have in the region, including in Oregon. But the transaction costs, the integration costs, the pancaking of transmission rates, and the complexity of the tariffs at a local level creates barriers to building out this part of the market in the Northwest that we hear from corporate procurers like the large tech firms of the world who have an easier time building things in RTOs like PJM or SPP. So I just wanted to add that clarification.
Thanks for that feedback. Do we have any other comments or questions on this topic? Happy to keep the floor open. Otherwise, I was going to suggest we more or less stick with our agenda in terms of when we take a break and suggest a 10-minute break, but happy to, I see Ravi's hand back up. So turn over to you, Ravi.
I'll make it a 10-second comment. Thank you, Spencer, for the clarification. Appreciate it. You can see my picture, but I was nodding what you were saying. But one question I do want you guys to think, don't have to answer it, is that does an RTO suddenly solve access to transmission from coastal area renewable development? Meaning, do the challenges get easier to address, or the challenges stay the same? You don't need to answer, but think about it. Maybe we'll get that to at the end of the overall discussion, but something to think about.
Any quick feedback to that question from Ravi? Okay.
From just Travis Erie, IBW again. So I do believe that they're the same. I don't believe that RTO formation creates any easier pathway to integrate offshore wind into the system than the current system we have right now. Most of the transmission things that stand in the way of the transmission right-of-ways or transmission being built are the public process scenarios, and RTO is not going to remove any of that from the process that we have at hand. So I do have concern on RTO coming in where you could have difference in pricing, which could lead to the owners of the transmission systems, whether that's Bonneville Power Administration or the private utilities that operate transmission, to where they don't invest the same as they do right now, which could lead to a transmission system that is degraded in the way that it's operated. So I do have that still overarching concern that I haven't heard answers to, that I'm still listening to see where there's options that could benefit us. because I am in favor of expanding our renewables. I'm in favor of building transmission lines, but I'm in favor of doing it in a way that we continue to have the proper investments in our systems.
Thank you, Travis. And real estate, Robbie has a response.
No, I'd like to respond to Ravi's question first before we go back to him. So Renewable Northwest and NIPSI actually represent offshore wind developers. And I think the value proposition that our members see in this is that right now the capital costs and infrastructure costs getting an offshore wind economy built in Oregon are insurmountable for one utility. So having an RTO actually will allow a project built off the Oregon coast to sell to many customers in the region. And I think that's a real issue. I think the reason that they are so involved in this conversation is that they see a huge hurdle to getting their projects to market without some sort of a regional solution. I would defer to the developers of these resources on their expertise here over organizations that don't have experience integrating any offshore wind into the system. So I just wanted to point that out.
Thanks, Nicole. Robbie, did you have a follow-up comment?
Adam, I just want to, I know I'm between the break and these comments and this discussion, but great conversation. Thank you, Travis. Thank you, Nicole. I just want to make one point, and that is, I don't want the committee to think here that Boniface or Ravi are opposed or for RTO. We're just trying to provide, a rational thinking that should be considered from our standpoint about the pros and cons, and it's nowhere reflects that, we're either strong supporters or strong opposers. Right now, we're neutral. We believe in renewable development. We believe in transmission expansion. We have been doing that. I do that as part of my job 365 days, and I've been doing it for decades now. So our ultimate goal from my side, from a transmission side, is to ensure that we are situated to deliver and help both Oregon and Washington within our footprint to be able to meet their 100% clean power plant goals identified in the law. I think Oregon is by 2040 and Washington is by 2045, and work with our other states and through an interregional process to ensure that we can allow customers in both the states have access to other sort of resources, renewables from out of state. So I just wanted to make that as a general comment, because sometimes I may come across that Ravi is coming across as an anti-RTO, because every time I'm pulling that card out, I'm not. All I'm saying is, when making a decision or when you're putting this paper in front of the decision makers of whether Oregon should consider having a move towards an RTO, make sure that we are highlighting both the sides, so that the decision is made in a more holistic manner. It addresses both the sides, and the ones that are challenges are then addressed according to the challenges that are already benefits. They'll find the benefits to move forward in the decision making. So that's really what my comment was going to be. And thank you, and appreciate everyone being patient with some of my comments.
I appreciate the dialogue on this topic. So what I'm hearing is that there are certainly an RTO would take offshore wind as the example. There are new opportunities, as Nicole mentioned, sort of with a regional demand and potential new investment. But some of the challenges still remain in terms of needing to reinforce and upgrade transmission, and there are siting and permitting challenges, and those challenges don't go away, even though there's this new opportunity and potential new investment interested. Not that they can't be overcome, but they're still real. I'll leave a moment here if there are any other questions or feedback on this general topic. Otherwise, I will suggest we take our 10-minute break now and then come back. Okay. I will see everyone in 10 minutes. I will put up a break screen with a start time of just shy of 10:20. If you could turn on your camera just to let me know that you're back. I know a lot of folks have issues there. So but once I see a few faces, I'll assume we're all mostly back.
Ravi's back.
All right, thank you, Ravi. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Let's move on with the agenda. And just a reminder, as we go, if you can use the hand raise function, was a good suggestion. We should have been using it from the beginning, but we will continue to try and lean on that for the remainder of the meeting. And with that, we'll jump into the next question. So question number 8 was around environmental impacts. So question 8 was noted, sorry, my screen's cluttered here. Let me get to my slide. Aggressive carbon policies are already in place across the West, of course, including Oregon, particularly with HB 2021. So some of the literature found that it was unlikely that RTO formation would significantly accelerate a reduction in carbon emissions, and that there are other potential environmental considerations resulting from RTO formation. So again, similar kind of prompt question we had for the previous topics around looking for feedback on how the environmental impacts resulting from RTO formation would or would not be preferable to the status quo. A few subtopics around thermal dispatch, the geographic footprint of renewables development, environmental justice, and greenhouse gas accounting. So again, feel free as I go through the individual slides, if you have a particular comment or issue you'd like to raise, feel free to raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll try to get through the topic and then we'll have the discussion slide at the end like I've been doing. So general feedback. Overall, multiple commenters disagreed with the statement derived from the literature that it is unlikely that RTO formation would significantly accelerate a reduction in carbon emissions compared to the status quo. Multiple commenters cited reduced curtailment of renewables, more efficient dispatch of thermal, and the ability to better share resources across the wide region. One commenter noted that states generally have not identified how state clean energy policies would actually interact or be implemented within RTO markets. And multiple recent studies have identified that achieving state clean energy targets is, quote, predicated upon the existence of a fully integrated regional grid. So several of those recent studies have used assumption of a fully integrated regional grid as sort of the baseline for their analysis. No impact. One commenter offered that it is probably unlikely that an RTO formation would have much influence on environmental aspects in the electric sector. And cost optimization, one commenter emphasized that RTO markets are focused on finding the most economic and reliable solution to serve load and are not the best vehicle for promoting one particular state's policies over another. Thermal dispatch. State mandates. RTO formation would not preempt or otherwise undermine existing state laws, such as the coal phase out adopted by Oregon's SB 1547, for example. Inefficient thermal. Operation of an RTO would reduce the dispatch of the most inefficient, costly, and GHG emitting thermal units. One commenter noted that a recent technical study identifies a continued need for gas as a capacity resource through 2045, but that having an RTO will ultimately help to facilitate the replacement of that capacity at least cost. And sound RTO design can minimize the dispatch of thermal units and ensure that RTO markets avoid an outcome of diminishing the target environmental outcomes of existing policies. And any short-term increase dispatch of thermal units should be evaluated against the long-term benefits of RTO formation. Next, land use impacts of renewables development. Overall, multiple technical studies have identified that RTO formation would allow for a smaller land use footprint for renewables development to meet state clean energy targets. But it's complicated. While an RTO might result in less land use impact overall across the region, it could shift the locations of land use development for renewables. So perhaps more appropriate to consider this through state and local land use planning instead of RTO design. Existing processes. RTO formation would not eliminate or otherwise impact existing federal and state siting and permitting requirements for generation and transmission. And then environmental justice. One commenter suggested that it would not be possible to evaluate this issue absent an RTO market design, while others suggested an RTO could more effectively facilitate DER deployments, which states could leverage to support projects in environmental justice communities. Optimizing the efficient use of generation and transmission with lower costs for all, which would have a disproportionate positive impact in communities with higher energy burdens. RTO development. One commenter contends that environmental justice and equity considerations, quote, should absolutely be considered in the planning for an RTO, and that states should assert their authority over companies with a financial interest in RTO formation to ensure that these considerations are appropriately addressed in RTO design. An alternate view, a multi-state RTO cannot drive a single state's policies, particularly with regard to environmental justice, and these issues may be best addressed by PUCs. And this is, I think, the last subtopic here before the discussion slide, GHG accounting. Lack of consistency. Most commenters are in agreement that states with GHG policies have inconsistent ways of tracking emissions and attributing emissions to sources. One view is that this lack of consistency should be addressed in RTO design to develop a consistent regional mechanism in parallel with market design, and that developing such a mechanism is, quote, one of the central promises of a new Western RTO. Another view, one commenter argued RTO formation in the Northwest would not need to, quote, create a new policy construct to accommodate state GHG objectives. And the CAISO and the New England ISO have established, quote, robust solutions that accommodate disparate state GHG policies. A third view, while improved regional GHG accounting could be a beneficial outcome of an RTO design, it is, quote, not a fundamental prerequisite. Cost of compliance. The cost of compliance with a particular state's GHG policy should be allocated to the customers of that state and not passed on to members in other states. And then here are a few principles for GHG accounting that one commenter suggested that should be included in RTO design. Record retention policies for documents relating to accounting and verifying GHGs, transparency in accounting, including reporting data and sharing verification, scheduling, allowing scheduling coordinators to incorporate GHGs in energy sourcing and dispatch, tracking for all power transactions, including the source of power bought and sold, clear guidelines for how to treat GHG tracking from unspecified power purchases, and development of GHG tracking report that includes accounting for state purposes. So here we are on the discussion slide. Go ahead and find the hand raise function if you'd like to weigh in while I kind of prompt these questions here. Again, the first one, same we've had. Do you support or oppose a particular perspective represented? Would you emphasize something differently? Is there something missing? And then a particular question on GHG impacts. I know this was multiple commenters took issue with one of the findings from a literature review. So the question I have is, would RTO formation actually accelerate GHG reductions? Or is the perspective that it would help states like Oregon meet its existing GHG reduction policies more cost effectively? So perhaps the argument is that states couldn't actually meet their GHG policies absent an RTO. Just trying to get some clarification there on sort of the perspective. Equity and environmental justice. While RTO shouldn't be evaluated as a tool to solve all the industry's problems, as we've discussed many times already, to what extent should equity and environmental justice concerns be fundamental considerations when evaluating potential RTO formation? For example, ensuring that historic injustices aren't exacerbated by RTO formation. And I will open it up for discussion. And please use the hand raise function on the WebEx to get us started. Nicole.
Thanks, Adam. So I wanted to point out that the question on, I think the very first slide says that, you know, several states have aggressive clean energy standards. So how would having an RTO result in anything better? Or I don't remember the exact question, but I just want to point out that having a clean energy standard is not the same as meeting the clean energy standard. And that there have been several deep decarbonization studies done in the region. There was a regional one done a few years back. Washington did one just last year when they updated their state energy strategy, and there was one done in Oregon just recently. And all those studies modeled the ways that the states could meet their clean energy standards, but they were all of the sort of options were predicated on the existence of a regional market. So we don't have an analysis right now other than the state-led study, which is not on a really a very fine-tuned state-by-state basis that shows us, you know, how or what the challenges to meeting those clean energy standards without a regional market would be. Because all the assumptions have been that there would be one in place. So just to point that out.
Thank you, Nicole. Looking for other hands raised here. Everyone's gotten shy after our 10-minute break. There we go. Ben and then Mary.
So I just wanted to kind of point out in our draft power plan, we do definitely have a item calling for more research on siting. I think one of the things most people don't realize about the Northwest Power Act is it set up a system where it comes to hydro, where we have kind of protected waterways that are universal throughout the Columbia River Basin. So I guess one of the advantages that you might say an RTO would have is you could come up with a consistent approach, sort of like that for siting, where you can look at what are the underlying sort of considerations that need to be made, come up with areas that are sensitive, and it's something that we've flagged in our power plan, and something that while it's out for comment right now and not final, that we're still definitely considering as kind of an effort that needs more thought and more research. And so I again don't know that this is an RTO specific item, but I do think that there's not a universal approach to how these things are handled right now. And an RTO naturally creates a centralized structure where you could probably have a more universal or more consistent approach, at least to something like this, on environmental impacts and any sort of siting considerations. Of course, not taking away the fact that each state has its own siting concerns and its own thoughts. And we particularly called out the fact that it's not a site-by-site sort of consideration. It's more of a kind of aggregated consideration. When you're talking about wind in the gorge, each site was evaluated individually, but the overall scope of it together is harder to kind of put your arms around. And so just kind of flagging that it is something that we've had conversations about, obviously with multiple states and multiple entities that are concerned about it. And I think it's something that carefully approach an RTO. Again, it could be a platform to help you get further, but it's not necessarily innate in the fact that you would form an RTO, that you would have some approach to that.
Thank you, Ben. Mary?
Thank you. Just a couple of comments. I think that actually dovetail well on what Ben was just saying. You know, I think in terms of sort of emission reductions, the way that I think of this, and I think the way, you know, probably many utilities think of it is.
I think we maybe just lost your audio there, Mary.
Oh, I'm sorry. Am I back?
You're back, yes.
Okay. You know, really thinking about what utilities need to do or what needs to happen in order to achieve that decarbonized grid. And I think you really bring in everything that we've already talked about today. You're talking about transmission, utilizing the existing system more efficiently, as well as building new transmission. You're talking about new types of technology that can be integrated to, you know, get through the periods of time when you don't have renewable generation, and then also getting more renewables on the system more efficiently. And so I think from our perspective, an RTO can really provide some benefit in terms of enabling those things to happen more cost effectively and more quickly. But I don't think the RTO in and of itself reduces emissions, as it were, just sort of operating the market. Sort of market rules themselves aren't necessarily designed to reduce GHG emissions specifically. I think the idea is to operate the system more effectively and enable that decarbonization to happen more efficiently, more cost effectively. I will say that there are some state policies that would need to be considered in terms of how the dispatch works. And, for instance, California has a carbon price. If California was, participating in the RTO, and Washington has will have a carbon price as well, those state policies will need to be reflected in the market rules in some fashion. But I think an RTO just sort of by itself doesn't necessarily accomplish emission reduction. The other point I wanted to make too, that it's related to this, again, is sort of thinking about what benefits an RTO can really provide beyond kind of what we have today. And I think an existing issue that we have today is this sort of GHG accounting question. And I think that issue continues regardless of RTO or not, in terms of how are states able to look at, whether or not they're meeting their goals. What are the accounting tools you're really using? Not goals, required policies. What are states really using to verify that those policies are being met? I think that issue exists with or without an RTO. I think the benefit of an RTO is really having a common platform to start with to figure out what kind of tracking system, or what kind of, I don't even really like a tracking system, but what kind of accounting system are we all collectively going to use to account for the different state policies? And I think that's really important, because right now we don't have kind of that common platform to come together and decide a way to do it. And when you have different states adopting different approaches, you end up with conflicts between states in terms of how they're accounting for the same energy. So I really think that it's not so much that an RTO itself does accounting, but I think the RTO framework can enable, states to come together and adopt a common framework across the RTO footprint in terms of how to allocate and account for energy and emissions.
Thank you, Mary. I want to go next to Oriana.
Thanks, Adam. And apologies if you can hear my washer rattling in the background. But it's no surprise to anyone, I really want to address the discussion question related to equity and environmental justice. And I think going back to something Mary said, I don't think either GHG impacts or equity and environmental justice are inherent to the formation of an RTO. It really comes down to how that happens, what principles and values are taken into account, and how that informs the structural development. And I think it's worth noting also that this is not just an issue for Oregon, but an issue that would have to be internalized with agreements amongst other states who would be involved in an RTO formation, whether it's a Northwest option or whether Oregon chooses to join California. So I think we really have to think about what are the values and principles that we as a state want to see play out, what are the goals that we have, and where are they shared with other entities who might participate in a market or organizational formation. As to equity and environmental justice specifically, I think we talked in our last meeting, and I think it was Nicole who raised the idea of some sort of advisory body. And I think we really strongly endorse that idea of the governance being an important place where equity and environmental justice are considered. And I think it plays out in two ways. One is directly for communities. And we talked a little bit about the siting issues that potentially come up, making sure that an RTO doesn't have unintended impacts or burdens for communities associated with increased demand in different ways. Some accountability for market participants, I think, will be really important, that to enter into the market, you have to adhere to certain values or principles related to equity or environmental justice with the projects, and they shouldn't be in some sort of contention with community. I think would be a really important thing from our perspective. But then actually having a body that's built into the governance that can support just evaluation of market participants, of market structure, and make sure things are working in ways, and also be responsive as kind of an ombuds entity to community concerns that might come up. That's one entity that can deal with environmental justice communities broadly, but I think I raised in our last conversation as well, the importance of figuring out how to address sovereign nations, tribal governments specifically, within an RTO, and the fact that sovereign nations are part of the region, but have their own governmental interests. Some of them develop their own renewable energy projects, some of them have their own utilities. And so that will be a really important consideration into RTO formation, is any government that is hoping to engage its state in an RTO will have to, I think, have really good consultation with the tribes within the current borders of the state. But then also a broader RTO formation needs to have some seat at the table for all tribes who might have land or energy resources that might impact that RTO. And there should be special considerations given to valuing resources to build wealth for tribal governments around projects, and also making sure that siting doesn't impact cultural and historical resources, that increased demand doesn't have a negative effect in that way. So I think governance is really important, and a way to address this issue. And then I think the last point I'll make is just that first sentence about RTOs shouldn't be evaluated as a tool to solve all of the industry's problems. I think there are ways we can replicate problems in the system, and there are ways that we can acknowledge those problems or opportunities and use an RTO to make some course corrections. And I think that can happen on a couple of fronts. One is really valuing DERs and community-based resources. We might not necessarily have requirements around utilities to procure those resources in the fullest extent that might be valuable from an environmental justice perspective, but there may be ways in an RTO that you could really think about valuing DERs, valuing community-based projects, and establishing those wealth building opportunities. It's also worth noting that utilities, in addition to developers, stand to really benefit from an RTO and potentially have a particular benefit for their shareholders. I think we need to think about how to create some equity on that front and make sure the benefits flow to ratepayers, but also how can you take some of that potential profit or opportunity and shift it in ways that can create benefit back to the communities. So it's really about balancing benefits and burdens. Thanks, sorry, I realize I went on for a while there, but hopefully there was some good information there for Odo and some food for thought for other participants.
Great, I appreciate the feedback, Oriana. Does anyone have any responses to Oriana or any of the other comments or additional feedback they'd like to provide? Okay, Spencer, I see your hand up.
Thanks, Adam. I wanted to say two things. First, I do think there is pretty good evidence in a way that the arguments that are made about RTO formation and having a more efficient grid are sometimes hard to come up with good data to reinforce an argument. But for environmental impacts of RTO formation, one area that I think is hard to dispute is that an RTO forces the most efficient thermal resources to run soonest and the most. There was a study done 10 years into the creation of RTOs that compared about 1,000 power plants in RTOs versus states without RTOs. And it found that those plants ran about 14% more efficiently in an RTO on a heat rate basis, which means they used less fuel. And in general, those would be the plants that have the best pollution controls and are built the most efficiently. So at least for now, that study's a little bit dated now and a little bit harder to extrapolate to 2021 and going forward. But I think there's pretty good evidence of at least the thermal side of the grid being run more efficiently and having pretty direct impacts on lower emissions in an RTO. The second thing I wanted to mention is, building on Oriana's last comments, as Oregon and the West thinks about RTO formation, I think we're in a nice position in a sense to learn from how governance has worked or hasn't worked in the other 7 markets in the US that we can draw from. And frankly, some of those markets have done better and worse on governance. In our experience, having a relatively flatter organization like what the CAISO runs, which gets more complicated once you add more states, but that's a better model to encourage more participation by more stakeholders. The RTOs that from their beginning set up complicated hierarchical committee structures, they certainly work, but it does create a barrier to participate for consumer advocates, nonprofits of all stripes, and smaller independent developers. And so to the extent that the legislature can think about what are the best practices from other RTOs in governance that we could draw from, I think we could do better than some RTOs have done. And finally, on that point, FERC finally established an Office of Public Participation recently, which was way overdue, which creates a kind of ombudsman function at the federal level to support some of these environmental justice, equity, and governance issue oversight that's been missing, I think, at the federal level for some time.
Thank you, Spencer. Next, we'll go to Ravi. If you're speaking, Ravi, you must be on mute because I'm not hearing you.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so what I was saying was I think Oriana and Spencer were right on mark on several fronts. So I just want to, number one, emphasize that I agree, especially on in an RTO with having a single system dispatch, being able to dispatch lower heat rate units versus a high heat rate unit definitely does help in the decarbonization goals. So definitely. I think one thing for you all to consider is that all the 7 RTO ISOs that have been formed, they were formed in a carbon environment. This is an opportunity for the region to consider what an RTO would look like in a decarbonized world. So this is definitely an opportunity, but it also presents a lot of challenges as discussed previously, both as mentioned by Oriana and Mary, and as well as Spencer. So I think what I would like to you guys to consider is that, whereas an RTO may not be the all-in solution, but it is also an opportunity to see how we can drive the future decarbonization in the region. And I use the term region because it's not just Oregon, but it's Oregon, Washington, and other states that may be part of this whole effort eventually, as how we can best optimize not just the transmission side, but also on the demand and the supply side, in a manner that results in a cleaner and a greener footprint that none of the other RTOs have been able to achieve. So it's an opportunity and a challenge. So creativity and innovations will be at the highest here, but don't forget the cost part. The cost and how it will overall impact the rates, and the rates do impact the economy. So, there are a lot of high energy consuming businesses that are central into Oregon and Washington. So consider that as one of the points as you proceed in discussion with the formation of an RTO. You can call it an RTO under a clean power plan or a decarbonized world. And that's really what you're trying to hit and target for. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Robin. I think some of those themes we'll see in questions 10 and 11 coming up, in particular on governance and market design. I saw Nicole, you have your hand up.
Thanks, Adam. I wanted to connect something that I heard Oriana mention that was brought up earlier in the conversation by Commissioner Tani, the importance of governance. I think, in order for states like Oregon to ensure that the values that we hold true in our state are maintained if our utilities should join an RTO, it's important to have that governance piece right. It's important for the states to retain the ability and the authority over those important issues. So I put environmental justice and use of DERs and things like that in that category.
Thank you, Nicole. So not seeing any other hands raised. Unless you have any additional comments or feedback on this one, I'll move to question number 9. And not surprising, you probably can tell based on the timing here, I'm not sure we're going to get to much roundtable discussion, but I think it's good because we're having good, thorough discussion on each of these topics. So we might have to quickly address some of our additional questions when we get there, but I think we're doing okay on time. So question number 9 on climate resilience. I think this one might go a little bit quicker. So again, similar to the previous questions, looking for feedback on how climate resilience implications resulting from RTO formation would or would not be preferable to the status quo. Thinking about our rapidly changing climate, catastrophic wildfires, historic ice storms, the dense smoke issues we had impacting transmission earlier this year, et cetera. Let's get into the feedback there. Again, it's you've heard this one before. Uncertainty without knowing specific design of an RTO, it's hard to really address the question. Sharing resources, neighboring utilities and regions, sharing resources with one another is, quote, simply easier in an RTO and makes it easier to respond to climate-driven extreme weather. Transmission paths. An RTO may reduce barriers to transmission development, allowing for additional routes for energy to flow in the event a path goes down. Example, the Blue Lake Fire on the Coy this summer. Situational awareness. An RTO may provide superior operational visibility and control of generators and transmission to better respond to severe events. Complications. Stakeholders need to be working on resiliency within the current model, and an RTO formation may introduce complications to those efforts at the local level. Diversity of resources. Geographic diversity. Assuming an RTO drives additional transmission development, it could help to support the development of a diversity of least cost resources over a wide area. This geographic diversity will help the region to ensure the resilience and reliability of the overall system. Resource procurement. States will retain purview over decisions about resource procurement, while an RTO will dispatch the resources made available according to least cost. Least cost solutions. Development of resilient solutions closer to load could be at odds with the development and operation of least cost regional transmission solutions. Again, FERC Order 2222 came up. That order allows for microgrid projects to aggregate and bid into wholesale energy markets, potentially providing a new pathway to develop these resilient solutions. One commenter, however, noted or believes that it is, quote, unlikely that an RTO would be a form that would promote microgrids. And then on the issue of wildfire nexus, mitigation versus impacts, unlikely that an RTO could be designed to do much to mitigate wildfire risks, but it must be designed to take into consideration how wildfire could impact operations and services. Diversification, the diversification of resources, geography, and alternate paths that an RTO may make viable can help to address the risks posed by wildfire to the power system. Common standards and practices, an RTO can improve situational awareness and support the development of common standards and practices, such as for operational measures like public safety power shutoff during high wildfire risk scenarios. Transmission development. While an RTO is unlikely to mitigate wildfire risks, to the extent it supports additional transmission development, an RTO could alleviate constraints that would otherwise occur due to paths being impacted by wildfire. And then our discussion questions. So again, do you support or oppose a particular perspective? Would you emphasize something differently? Is there something missing? And then the two new questions I'm throwing out there. Again, while RTOs aren't a tool to solve all the problems of the industry, to what extent should considerations of climate resilience be essential to evaluation of RTO formation? And community resilience, given our rapidly changing climate, how important is it that future energy markets like those that would be operated by an RTO provide a pathway to the development of DERs that can improve community resilience? And I didn't get my prompt there to navigate to the hand raise function, but if you have comments there, I'd ask that you use the hand raise function to let me know. It's possible everyone's just excited to get to governance, which is next. Okay, I'm happy to move on if we don't have anyone who wants to weigh in on comments here. I know some of the distributed energy resources touched on some of these questions kind of in the previous question. So, and now there are, I see we'll go to Representative Marsh first and then to Oriana. Oh, I think you're on mute, Representative Marsh.
Thanks. I put the video on, but not the mute. So this is such a great conversation. I very much come to this from a policy perspective and not a technical perspective. But given that, I think climate resilience is the most important thing in front of any of us, and we have to certainly as a policymaker, I would want to understand how the RTO nurtures or interacts with questions around climate resilience. I don't think we can do anything without those considerations. And then in terms of community resilience, I just want to note at the same time Odo is doing this study, you're also charged with doing a study on community energy projects. We are gathering information through HB 2021 from the utilities on the development of local projects. We are investing $50 million into local projects to try to get some experience with the multiple benefits of those and ways to calculate that in terms of dollar terms. So all of that is to say, I think community resilience is of extraordinary interest to our communities. And in the next couple of years, I think we'll actually start to get some very tangible understanding of both those benefits and how you put a financial value on them that could be important for this conversation.
Thank you for that feedback. Oriana?
Yeah, I just want to echo everything Representative Marsh just said. I think I'm sure it doesn't come as a surprise that based on my previous comments, we strongly support figuring out how an RTO can provide that pathway to development of DERs and valuing of DERs in a regional system. We see that as really essential to community resilience, that having a variety of different energy sources and scales is important to a balanced energy diet. But I think there's also the bigger consideration when we look to some of the fires in California of just the risks associated with large transmission systems and some of the challenges that have shown up in Oregon related to the planned safety power shutoffs. So I think really making sure that communities are microgridded, that there are DERs online, are a really important way to address the times in our system when transmission needs to be shut off to address fire risk. But I think within that, there's also the opportunity that you can have the dual resiliency benefit, but then also the dual wealth building benefit for community, or the dual balancing benefit for community that can come from really looking at the interaction of our distributed energy system and our transmission system.
Great, thank you for that. Next, I see Spencer's hand.
Thanks, Adam. I just wanted to provide a few thoughts responding to Representative Marsh's comments and questions about climate resilience. I think there's a lot to be said about community resilience, and we've covered some of that in terms of how RTOs provide a platform for and a market signal for more distributed development of resources. But on a bigger scale, climate resilience question, I guess I would turn your attention and legislators' attention to how SPP and MISO fared during the winter storm this past year versus how Texas fared. And I guess I provide this example with a little bit of caution. The Northwest was designed for interregional transfers. We've got transmission lines that were designed and financed with a view towards moving power between British Columbia, the Northwest in the US, and California in the Southwest. So we do have a system that was set up in a bilateral context to move power across 1,000 miles of the West. But the example of the winter storm, I think, was illustrative that both SPP and MISO had some blackouts. They had a really challenging time with an extreme weather event that is what we expect more of with climate change, but they did not have the outages that Texas experienced. And one principal reason for that was they were far more able to share neighboring resources with each other, and for neighbors to share each other's neighbors' resources with each other. And that adjoining neighbor and a neighbor a step removed function is something that RTOs do, I think, in a more optimized way than any other system. And Texas was exhibit A of having an asynchronous system isolated in a single, very large state that lacked that functionality. So you might consider the Northwest being sort of in between those two systems and having contract-based transmission rights that don't optimize neighbors sharing neighbors' resources in the kind of wide area extreme weather events that climate change is going to make, is already making more persistent.
Great, thank you. And I saw Representative Marsh, your hand is still raised, and I saw you pop back on the camera. I didn't know if you had a follow-up comment or not, but if you did, I didn't want to skip over you.
Sorry, just bad hand management.
No problem. See no other hands raised, then I know we have two big topics to come. I will move us on to question 10 on governance. So obviously this is a topic that's been kind of woven throughout our discussion, both today and a couple weeks ago, that there's a need for effective governance of any RTO that would ensure Oregon's perspectives are adequately represented. So we're looking for feedback here on priorities or principles that should be incorporated, whether there are best practices from other regions, potentially new practices that don't exist that maybe would be useful, how to protect state interests, and then governance principles. So in terms of best practices, multiple commenters, not surprisingly, suggested that the governance proposals being considered by the PowerPool's Western RA program, and there's ample material out there on that, are a good reference for best practices that would be applicable to an RTO. State involvement, meaningful state involvement in RTO governance was identified, quote, as a key to a well-functioning RTO. And SPP's Regional States Committee and the EIM's body of state regulators were both cited as examples. Member involvement. One commenter noted that SPP has, quote, a strong member participation model of governance, which encourages member engagement to develop rules and policies. Diverse perspectives. One commenter suggested RTO governance should incorporate committees or other modes of participation that incorporate diverse perspectives involving stakeholders in a nominating committee to select board members, being identified as one such mechanism. And the need for balance. It will be, quote, important to balance the need for public stakeholder input with the needs of participating entities when designing RTO governance structures. Best practices continued here. One commenter identified some unique strengths of two competing RTO governance models, SPP and EIM. In terms of SPP, the model has, quote, been effective in allowing for growth and expansion to encompass multiple states and regions. The independence and flexibility of its governance structure, quote, should be replicated, especially with regards to its transparent decision-making. EIM, the use of a nominating committee representing diverse stakeholders to select EIM board members may be worth replicating. Western EIM, the reservation of, quote, ultimate decision-making with the CAISO Board of Governors, which is appointed by the California governor with the fiduciary responsibility for California ratepayers, is a fundamental element of EIM governance, which makes it, quote, unworkable for an RTO. SPP, one commenter suggests that an RTO should have, quote, prioritized representation for ratepayers and customers who, quote, ultimately pay for the RTO product, and that the SPP's model in this regard should, quote, be unacceptable. Excuse me. Protecting states' interests. Market design. RTO market design should not occur without significant support from participants and the state, as appropriate design cannot mitigate an RTO from, quote, overriding state policies. Similarly, one commenter suggests that an RTO design should include protections designed to retain and/or not preempt state and local decision-making to the extent possible. GHG accounting, RTO formation should require, quote, compliance with current and future state agency policies regarding GHG accounting requirements. One commenter noted that different state carbon and renewable rules can, quote, significantly impact the efficiency and effectiveness of an RTO and that aligning state policies could mitigate this. This was a comment I think I already had earlier, but meaningful state involvement in RTO governance was identified as, quote, a key to a well-functioning RTO. FERC engagement, states should intervene in FERC proceedings related to the development of markets where the proposed governance structure does not meet the needs of the state, including obtaining Section 205 filing rights. State regulatory and legislative requirements, if properly designed, should not result in conflict between RTO operation and utility compliance with those requirements. And then governance principles, sort of wrapping all this up. Independence, something we certainly talked about at the previous meeting. Transparency, stakeholders and board processes should be fully transparent. Technical competence, there should be a requirement that board members understand organized markets and the unique qualities of participating utilities. Equitable allocation, boards should maintain a fair and equitable market that ensures an equitable allocation of costs and benefits. Require for balanced decisions, governance structure should prevent an RTO from, quote, making significant policy changes without significant support from states and market participants. And a fiduciary duty, governing policy should clearly define the public service role of the RTO and the related fiduciary duty of its board. And continued principles here. Governance decisions should protect the market from market power manipulation. The board should ensure that all RTO policies comply with federal and state regulations. Board should maintain confidence of stakeholders that they are fairly balancing the range of interests and priorities of diverse stakeholders. Board makeup should represent the sectoral and geographic diversity of the territory covered by the RTO, and this should be periodically revisited. Governance structure should allow for, quote, meaningful input from public power, state policymakers, retail customer, and public interest advocates, in addition to market participants. And this was, again, a comment about SPP that RTO should have prioritized representation for ratepayers and customers who ultimately pay for the RTO product, and that SPP's model should be unacceptable. One commenter suggests that public power have prioritized and separate representation. And then the discussion questions. So again, do you support or oppose particular perspective? Would you emphasize something differently? Is there something missing? And then two new questions here. Notwithstanding the entanglement of CAISO's governance with the California governor and legislature, multiple commenters identified various elements of SPP's and EIM's governance that they support or oppose. Can you articulate any particular elements of either of those governance structures that should not or must not be replicated as part of any RTO governance structure? And then state involvement. Many commenters indicated that it should be a requirement for states to have strong involvement in the design of an RTO and having meaningful input during the ongoing governance. Can you identify specific elements or define what that state involvement must look like from your perspective? And with that, I will open it up to questions and feedback. If you could use the hand raise function. I know there are comments on this one. We'll start with Nicole.
Thanks, Adam. So I want to talk a little bit about the difference between the governance structure of the SPP and the EIM. Earlier, I saw in one of the slides, it was talked about SPP's transparency in decision-making. I think the transparency in decision-making at SPP is true if you are a market participant, meaning if you are a utility that participates in that market. That statement is not so true if you are a stakeholder who's not a utility in that market. And so I'll explain my view of the differences between the structures. So in the SPP governance structure, the committees are all populated by market participants or utility members. And a lot of the committee meetings are held open to the public and have comment periods, but there aren't any committee structures where outside stakeholders or non-market participants have an opportunity to have a seat at the table or a voice in proposals or amendments related to the market. The alternative is in the EIM governance structure. There are committees such as the nominating committee and the RIF and the GRC that have positions open for stakeholders that are not utilities, that are participants in the market. And this is a really important issue here, in that when you have the opportunity, for example, on the nominating committee, as someone who's not a utility participant, or as an organization or as an individual that's not a market participant, but that is equally interested and affected by the decisions made in the market, you have a direct connection to how the board is nominated and how the ultimately decisions of the market are operated. Now, I will say that has evolved over time in the EIM, but in general, I think we support a governance structure that's more similar to the committee structure in the EIM versus the closed committee structure of the SPP.
Thank you, Nicole, for that feedback. Are there any other questions? I don't see the hand raise function, but I saw Sarah turn her camera on, so I was wondering if she maybe had a comment.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot, obviously there's a lot here, and there's certainly a lot of different structures to compare it to. I do think that part of the product that we have produced for the Western Resource Adequacy Program, which is pointed to a couple times in these comments, kind of did go through this process in a way, in the sense that that effort has looked to or has sought to take sort of the best of what comes from the energy imbalance market. Examples would be a pretty similar version of a multi-sector nominating committee to essentially select the slate of candidates for the independent board, which is something EIM obviously doesn't have as a totality. We also have borrowed heavily from the qualification criteria of what we're looking for in independent board members, which includes, broad, diverse experience and representation of multiple sectors and parts of our community broadly, really to bring that diversity to the board. So there's a lot of good stuff in there. And my observation is simply to say, without trying to sound self-congratulatory, because we have a lot of work to go still, there's a lot of good stuff in that work product that already has been sort of a process of looking at different things. And SPP is the program operator for the Northwest Power Pool RAP, but they haven't really played a strong role in terms of informing what the governance structure should look like. That's really come from a conversation that's been ongoing for a couple of years with the Stakeholder Advisory Committee, with legal experts in this area, with the membership. So it might be valuable to point to that. It is not complete. We are still in a process of having dialogue, and ultimately those components go inside of a FERC filing that has yet to see the light of day in front of FERC. So more to come there, but I simply wanted to acknowledge that I do think we have been going through a process of trying to find a best practice fit for the region through that work.
Thank you, Sarah. I certainly appreciate that, and that came through strongly in the comments. Any other feedback or general thoughts on this topic? Commissioner Tani?
I think the comments really illustrate the tensions that come forward in in this question and the complexity of arriving at balanced governance that will be sustainable over the long term and through this transition. I think one of the challenges, and this is just to put a finer point on the earlier conversation, is when we say in these comments, you know, we don't want Oregon state policy to be overridden, or in the GHG conversation, for example, it has to comply with state GHG goals. That same will hold for Wyoming and Utah and other partners who are not in the same place as Oregon. And that is both the complexity of moving the conversation to a regional forum and the importance of having all of those voices in the discussion. And what that means at the end of the day is the results won't necessarily always be the way Oregon would have done it if Oregon had been on their own. And that is the balancing act, right? Are there enough benefits, enough opportunities? It lowers the cost of decarbonizing enough that's okay. But we have to recognize, even in a balanced governance model, it will be balanced with a wide variety of interests. It won't be just Oregon's, and that's okay. It'll just be that ongoing dialogue. And you know, in some parts of the country that has worked relatively well. In other parts of the country, I think about the complexity around the MOPR and local communities being frustrated about clean energy procurement, or ZEVs in Illinois. It can be really complicated to get over time to keep the RTO design working and aligned with the breadth of state policies that might be on the table. So it's just a tension that will just continue to be there, and we just have to sort of own it and recognize it and deal with it in order to capture the benefits.
Thank you for that. Are there additional comments on this? And I think these, these issues have been coming up, and we've certainly discussed them throughout, and I suspect we'll continue with the next question around market design. So unless there's anything else on this, I will move us forward. And I will note, I think I will, right at 11:30, I'll take a pause. We'll probably be just beginning kind of our discussion of question 11, but I'll pause to see if there are any public comments, just to make some opportunity for that. And then we might push a little beyond 12 if that's okay, but I think we're within striking distance of getting through everything. So question 11, around market design optionality. So obviously there are numerous ways energy markets could be designed. The studies we reviewed certainly considered multiple different constructs, everything from the bilateral status quo to an expansion of EIM and potential day-ahead markets to full RTOs, either single RTOs across the West or multiple full RTOs. So that's really what we were seeking feedback here with this question. General, bigger is better. It's definitely feedback we heard. A bigger, more diverse footprint would be desired to spread out and increase the amount of variable renewable output across the map. But also, as noted, as you do that, it also adds complexity. Minimum size. There is a minimum size geographic footprint needed to, quote, justify the cost of developing and transitioning to an RTO. And one commenter suggested one explicitly, that the minimum size for an RTO is probably, quote, the Northwest region, and then any RTO footprint that fragments that region could create friction and inefficiencies. CAISO expansion. Before CAISO could expand into a regional RTO, it would, quote, have to adapt its governance structure to become independent from the government of California. Incrementalism. A full RTO, quote, may not be necessarily the right solution. For the West at this time, should be expected that grid integration, evolution, and incremental expansion will continue. Status quo. Partial regionalization is represented by more utilities, and soon Bonneville participating in EIM, and the development of a potential EDAM is preferable to RTO formation for the Northwest. Retail benefits, again, bigger is better was the general theme that multiple commenters suggested generally a bigger footprint will increase net benefits to retail customers. Another view, some preliminary analysis by one commenter suggests that an RTO market footprint with and without CAISO may result in only a nominal difference in net benefits. A third view, to see real benefits, the RTO's geographic footprint needs to be, quote, large enough to generate diversity in load and generation. And this kind of tying back to the previous question, that perhaps governance is more important than focusing so much on specific benefits, that focus and emphasis should really be placed on developing effective independent governance rather than trying to maximize potential benefit achievable. Transmission, evaluation of the impact on retail benefits of expanding the geographic footprint must also consider the increased cost for transmission as that footprint grows. Scale of the benefits. One commenter pointed to a recent study that found 3 times the gross benefits would accrue from a fully functional RTO. Again, that's one that would include imbalance in day-ahead markets, RA, and transmission planning functions compared to the status quo, even with existing EIM and planned EDAM market enhancements. Optionality, negotiated outcomes. An RTO can be organized in many ways, but will be the result of a larger negotiation with stakeholders, and the focus should be on building on best achievements of existing efforts. Single entity RTO would be, quote, preferable to establish a single entity responsible for all the traditional functions of an RTO, but that single entity should not be CAISO as currently constituted. Separating functions. A multi-jurisdictional regional system that separates out traditional RTO functions is possible, but a fully functional single RTO would provide the greatest benefits. One commenter contends that separated RA and transmission functions must be correlated and in sync across the same geography in order to realize, quote, the full benefits that an RTO could deliver. Another view, a multiple construct path could be viable as long as the important functions, transmission planning, RA, reserve sharing, and real-time marketing, are provided effectively, and this may allow for, quote, many of the benefits to be realized sooner with less execution risk. A third view, market alternatives that include, quote, hybrid constructs should be considered if not prioritized. The EIM model, the existing Western EIM, balances these interests well, providing diversity benefits to Oregon customers while preserving state influence. And then there's a question here on marginal cost dispatch and the need for market design to consider changes. Markets may need to grapple with this, quote, mostly academic issue. Ultimately, it's, quote, a great problem to be faced with for customers. And one commenter suggests this is going to be an issue with or without an RTO as more renewable generation is developed, and that the Northwest Power Pool effort will begin to address it. Capacity value. To mitigate these concerns, the market should account for capacity value, not just the marginal cost of dispatch. Flexibility. The flexibility of resources should be compensated by energy markets to address the value of these resources to integrate the uncertain and variable output of renewables. The Northwest hydropower resources are unique compared to other regions, and this unique resource must be taken into account when designing an RTO. And the missing money problem. Low margin cost prices in energy markets may not adequately reflect the value of the investment needed in dispatchable resources to maintain reliability. This issue is addressed differently by different RTOs, whether it's separate capacity payments in PJM, energy-only markets in ERCOT, or hybrid administratively determined capacity procurements such as SPP or MISO. So a couple of discussion questions here. So if you can get your hand raise function going, and I'll note again, I'll cut us off here in 5 minutes just to pause for public comment. Might be a bit disjointed, but just in case folks are joined in specifically for the 11:30 time, and then we can get back to this. And this wraps into some of our roundtable discussion anyway, which is going to be quite truncated, but one of these questions was really dealing with this issue. So discussion questions, do you support or oppose a particular perspective? Would you emphasize something differently? Is something missing? And then two additional questions. So missing money, as identified previously, we shouldn't look to RTO formation to solve all of our challenges. To what extent do you believe that potential RTO markets must be designed explicitly to address the so-called missing money problem? or would it be acceptable for out-of-market actions to continue to drive capacity procurement? And in terms of flexibility with respect to potential RTO formation, should the sector's needs for flexible capacity be evaluated separately from the challenges identified by the missing money problem? What potential RTO markets need to be designed to value flexible capacity explicitly, or would it be acceptable again for out-of-market actions to address this need for flexibility? And then, of course, there's the broader questions on incrementalism, which I was planning to address in the roundtable discussion, but I think we're going to merge all that together here to get us to complete our agenda. So I'll open up the floor now, and again, we'll pause here in a few moments. And it looks like Commissioner Tawney has her hand up. No, she does not.
It's poor hand management on my part.
I like that phrase, poor hand management.
Sarah, sometimes I feel like I might not understand what missing money problem means, because I think I've heard the concept in a couple of different areas. Sometimes I hear about it in terms of like, baseload resources that are part of the market that are really needed for those peak times, but they may not have the kind of capacity payment or capacity compensation mechanisms in place to really make it economic to keep that plant operative in terms of whether or not we should mothball it or keep it operative for those few times a year it's needed. So sometimes I hear that's a missing money problem. Is that what we're talking about, or am I getting this? Is there something else going on? Does anyone know?
I think that's a very good question, because I do think it's my view of it is that it's used in different contexts by different interests for different reasons at different times. So I would be curious to hear feedback from others, and mostly I'm curious to hear feedback on however the problem is defined. Is it something that there's a view that an RTO needs to solve it, right? Or is RTO markets designed to economically dispatch the capacity that's made available to it, and shouldn't be relied upon exclusively to incentivize new capacity builds? So curious for additional thoughts on this one, or I could give you time to think about that juicy question, although I see Spencer has his hand up, and I was going to say, I'll take Spencer's comment, and then I will pause and open up the phone lines here for public comment, and then we can revisit this along with the additional roundtable discussion questions, which kind of tie into this anyway.
Thanks, Adam. I guess to respond to Sarah, I don't know that we need to sweat the missing money problem. I view it as something that comes up in the context of states that have already restructured and in which the vertically integrated utilities willingly or by the direction of the state legislatures have given up their procurement function. And that function is supposed to be run through the centrally operated markets. In the Northwest, we've gone so far down the path of setting up this resource adequacy program that Sarah's obviously one of the architects of and very knowledgeable about. And the states haven't restructured in the same way as they have in the East. And so I think it's entirely conceivable to set up an RTO that in the West, certainly in the Northwest, can sidestep this missing money problem because we haven't had that divestment of generation and transfer of the procurement function to an RTO. And I don't think we have to have an RTO that presumes that kind of restructuring in the West. So I don't view it as relevant a question for RTO formation here as it has been in the East.
And I'm happy to hear if others have thoughts on that question. But first I will ask Linda from Odo if she can check to see if there is any interest among attendees in public comment. It looked like most of our public attendees were associated with organizations that are on our committee, so I'm not sure, but there were some others, so I wanted to make sure we have a chance to hear from them.
In reviewing the attendee list, I don't see any hands raised or questions submitted.
I will check back in say 15 minutes, Linda. So if you can monitor that and let me know at 11:45, I will pause again. So we can continue with this discussion. here. I'm also happy to move on to the roundtable discussion, which kind of tees up this incrementalism question more explicitly.
I mean,
So unless there's a further discussion of this on the sort of flexibility and missing money or any of the other issues we just went through on kind of market design, I think there's some interest in talking more about incrementalism and what that looks like and how people might have different definitions of what that looks like to their organizations. So I will move us forward here. And that's my second question. So my second question is on incrementalism. My first one, which I previewed in the email I sent around to advisory members, starts with this problem statement that was raised by some folks when we talked about it at the last meeting. And so I'm asking if we can clearly articulate or define what problem or problems the sector is attempting to address by even evaluating RTO formation. And this is an addendum to this question that I added to it here. And what, if anything, has changed that makes this answer different in 2021 than it's been in previous decades, right? We've talked about RTOs multiple times. This isn't the first time it's come up in the Northwest. So has this changed? So I will open up the floor on that question. And then again, the next question is going to be on incrementalism. So stay tuned for that one.
Sarah, I'll throw a few things in. It's not an exhaustive list, so please others. But I think what I'm thinking about is, so RTO is a tool set that is unique in that it provides the ability to provide an integrated solution set for a number of functions and mechanisms that we need to achieve the kind of deep decarbonization and clean energy integration and greater and greater utilization of resource solutions that don't look like our traditional set of generation resources into the grid. And when I say integrated, I'm emphasizing the fact that the RTO brings all of the inputs and outputs from the market optimization part of the RTO, the transmission planning piece, and the resource adequacy piece potentially. And because those pieces are under one roof, they're able to leverage each other, and the data that's produced from these different functions and mechanisms can be integrated to provide that solution set where all the pieces are coming together. I'm certainly, and we'll get to this, but you can't not talk about the incremental approach when you're answering this part. We certainly have shown in this region that one thing that's working better than anything that has worked in 20 years, these decades, is the incremental approach. But we've also, while we acknowledge that, like politically, economically, from a regulatory perspective, that approach seems to be more successful in terms of achieving these different milestone pieces. It isn't well suited to bring them all together for that integrated solution set. So for me, that's kind of what sticks out here in the conversation.
Whoop. All right. Too many screens open. I'm jumping around here. Thank you, Sarah, for that. Any other thoughts or feedback to either this question or to Sarah's response? And again, I think it's particularly helpful, for members of the public and stakeholders in the legislature who are, a lot of us who work in the industry are thinking about these things all the time, and it's sort of, we know why we're thinking about RTOs and potential, but I think it's good to provide some of that level setting. We can also take a pause here. Oh, Nicole, go ahead, please.
Well, one, I just wanted to point out that Michael Young has his hand up too. So I just wanted to make sure you caught that. But, Sarah just nailed it, as she always does. That was perfect description. I think to answer the second quick question of what has changed, I'd say it's the conversation around the our states mandates on procuring more clean energy, but also around the impacts and effects climate change is having on our system. I mean, 10 years ago, we weren't seeing the radical climate weather impacts. We weren't dealing with the wildfire situation that we are today. And so I think for some people involved in this conversation, there's a feeling of desperation that if we aren't doing everything that we could possibly do to continue to live the lifestyles that we are hoping to live, and then we're not doing enough. And so for my members, it's how can we decarbonize the electricity sector? And this is one of the solutions, one of the important solutions to us.
Thank you, Nicole. Anything else anyone would like to add on this question? Otherwise, I was going to suggest we could pause here a moment, and we do have a public comment we could take. So I will, and I see Spencer, you have your hand up. I'll come back to you, Spencer, after we hear from Michael. If Linda, if you could unmute Michael or give him the ability to unmute.
Hi, testing.
Yes, hear you loud and clear.
Very good. Thanks very much for the opportunity to chime in. This has been a fantastic discussion, and I really appreciate the chance to hear what the stakeholder advisory committee is thinking, and as well as to share our perspective. I represent PNGC Power. We are a generation cooperative, G&T cooperative. 15 members, half of whom are in Oregon. So our members in Oregon share a commitment to a rational carbon policy. Like many have said here already, carbon is real, and we're committed to getting to 100% carbon neutrality by 2033. I will share that from our perspective as a public power organization, we see what's changed here is that it's always been pretty easy for us. We've just relied on cheap hydro from the BPA system and never really had to think very hard about what the how to shape the future. But what's really changing here is that we are expecting that the BPA system will, at some point in the foreseeable future, not be sufficient to meet the needs of the preference customer community. The easy way out is no longer going to be an option, and we're going to have to start making choices, and those choices are not easy. And in the context of our carbon commitment, we really do believe that a Northwest RTO is going to be an essential ingredient towards giving us options that go beyond just the BPA preference power portfolio, and giving us a market that we can turn to meet our needs, particularly in clean power, as well as facilitating the delivery across the transmission network, which may or may not be BPA. So far, we've had what we kind of call a virtual RTO system we can lean on in terms of transfer service, but we would very much like to enshrine open access so that we can get the power from the places that we want through the market that works in the interest of everyone here. Just wanted to share that as the thing that's changed for us since the last go around.
Thank you for that comment. And then we will go to Spencer and Oriana next.
Thanks, Adam. Throw my hat in for agreeing with the comments that Sarah and Nicole made about your first problem statement here. I wanted to add one other thing to Nicole's comments. I think it's important for the legislature to think about how can the grid be run and built in a different way that makes it attractive for sectors that aren't currently electrified to electrify. And so to me, there's a component here beyond decarbonizing the existing electrified part of the economy to keep power prices low enough to be attractive to other industries to electrify as well. And transportation is the obvious sector that has an opportunity to electrify with electric vehicles. But if we don't have a grid that is providing competitive energy prices across sectors, it's going to be harder to decarbonize sectors that aren't currently electrified.
Thank you, Spencer. Oriana?
Thanks. I think I want to raise what may not be considered like an obvious problem that's being addressed with an RTO, but I think if equity and justice and addressing some of the issues with our current energy system are not addressed in an RTO formation, if we're not making things more equitable with this approach, it doesn't feel like it achieves environmental justice goals. And I recognize that traditionally RTOs don't have an equity or environmental justice goal tied to them, but I want to appreciate how much Odo and other stakeholders have focused on this particular issue in comments and questions in this space, and want to make sure that that is part of the problem statement, is how do we do this in a way that really maximizes community benefit and minimizes environmental justice burden, and in particular recognizes tribal sovereignty.
Thank you, Oriana. Again, I'll note again for anyone who's on the meeting as a member of the public, if you've used the hand raise function, we will note you and get you in the queue here to jump in the discussion. I will go ahead though and move us on to the next question, which is on incrementalism. So incremental approaches to regionalization have been discussed as an alternative to RTO formation, and some have suggested there may be potentially different definitions for what might constitute sufficient versus insufficient incrementalism. So in terms of steps, what incremental steps have already been taken, are under consideration, or could be considered? I think we've talked a lot about the ones that have been taken, but the latter two, perhaps not as much. And then sufficient incrementalism. Can members define how much incremental regionalization is sufficient for their organization? It sounded like discussion at the last meeting was that perhaps there's some significant differences over sort of what's acceptable, quote unquote, incrementalism. So I will look for hands to be raised here. And I see Michael from PNGC still has his hand raised. I don't know if that's a residual hand raise. I forget what we're calling that. I think Representative Marsh had a comment for it, and then it was repeated.
Sorry, that was that poor hand management.
There you go, poor hand management. I lost the, yeah, poor hand management. Well, feel free to jump in though if you do have another question or another comment, Michael. But Sarah, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to sound repetitive, but I think I'll just attach what I said before to this and say that clearly there is some kind of track record being formed with an incremental approach to those three major functions of an RTO that has had some traction, but also has its own imperfections because it isn't integrated. So I just repackaged my answer for this slide. The thing I would observe that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I don't have an answer, is the journey that the region has been on with EIM, and then thinking about extended day-ahead market, EDAM through CAISO. We clearly haven't gotten that far yet. It's still concept, not operations. But one thing that's been sometimes observed is this desire, based on the diversity of our region and where folks are at with how pro or maybe a little bit more conservative they are about fully jumping into the full market optimization, that they might be able to choose which depth of market optimization they want. So for example, what I've heard this discussed, maybe I just want to sign up for the real-time sub-hourly optimization, EIM, or maybe I want to be day ahead and real-time optimization, or maybe I want full RTO. But there has been some acknowledgement in the West that different companies, different load interests may want different flavors. And the one thing we've never really answered that I've been thinking about is that even possible? Is it possible to have a mix, like an a la carte menu of market options, all operating under the same framework, or at some point from a feasibility operations perspective, the computer brain that runs the thing and has to do so efficiently without too much price separation, chaos? Is it even possible? So I think what I'm trying to say here is that incrementalism itself is a somewhat unproven concept in terms of adding on additional market services, and it's unclear to me how much optionality is actually inside of that.
Nicole.
Yeah, thanks. And I want to try to attempt to answer Sarah's question and in that, like, I think from our view, having at the end product is different functions managed by different organizations. You're not optimizing the efficiency of what you're getting. It's sort of like throughout our economy why there's bundling of insurance products. You get the full product at a more reasonable cost from X, Y, and Z because they offer all three of these things versus, you know, I mean, that's just the economic view of it. So I also think this term incrementalism has been used in a negative way, and people are now being put in these buckets. Are you an incrementalist? Or are you a, you know? But I think ultimately the way you define it really matters in that, are you, you know, if you're talking about we're incrementally getting to some steps, and then when you say sufficient incrementalism, like we're going to get to EDAM or we're going to get to a resource adequacy piece, and that's good enough for our organization, that is not good enough for the region. That might be good enough for specific organizations, but I'm hoping that the conversation around getting to the final step is looked at in the light of what is best for for the entire region, not what is best for X, Y, and Z entity. So the full benefits of what we come to need to outweigh the benefits that any one individual participant in this market could receive.
Thank you for that feedback, Nicole. Let's go to Commissioner Tawney and then to Ravi.
So a layer I would add to this conversation is there are constraints that are part of why we have ended up in the whatever this current approach is, this incremental approach. And those constraints don't evaporate because we've decided we want an RTO. And the constraints that particularly I think have driven us down this current path are the sort of the way California moved 20 years ago and set up, or 25 years ago, and set up through legislation, the Cal ISO, and a different reliability mechanism. Their RA mechanism is vested in the California Energy Commission, not in the CAISO, although of course there's deep interlacing. You know, we may get to California passing legislation to shift governance of the CAISO, maybe not. But it seems like highly unlikely they will change their RA structure. And so to incorporate them in the dispatch, to take advantage of all the solar that they want to send out on a daily basis, and all of their investment they're making in batteries, we will face a real challenge if we try to bring both the RA construct and a market construct together, because we'll not only just have to change their governance of their market, we'll have to change their governance of their RA, which isn't even on the table right now and is pretty hard to imagine. The second constraint that I think has sort of pushed us into this is BPA's non-jurisdictional existence. And that isn't going to sort of change and go away, and is going to require constant sort of working with and around, because they are the backbone of the transmission infrastructure. And that's okay. That brings a lot of value to customers as well. But I'm not sure that because of those two pre-existing conditions, amongst many others, those two seem particularly difficult to fundamentally change to make a west-wide RTO possible. And so you're then always left with, well, what am I going to give up then? Do I give up the dispatch with California so that I can have everything under one roof? Do I give up something else so that I've got BPA at the table because they're such an important player? And so I think we just sort of inherently here in Oregon don't sort of, there isn't a sort of perfect RTO that we're comparing to. We're comparing to sort of the art of the possible given the existing landscape we're operating in. And so I'm always sort of thinking, well, then what's the cost benefit trade-off for customers? This is a route to accomplish the state's goals at lower cost. It doesn't automatically decarbonize the grid, but it creates some optimizations that reduce the cost of optimizing the grid. And so to the degree that I can enable that as a regulator for customers, then I want to do that in whatever small role we play as the regulators in this conversation. So let me just leave it there, but I think we have to be careful about holding out a perfect RTO as a possibility. Or an Eastern style. Maybe the way to put it is an Eastern style RTO, because we aren't starting with a blank slate.
Thank you for that feedback. We'll go to Robbie next. And just one note, if any members of the public, again, have interest in making a comment, please use the raise hand function and we will make sure there's time for you.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Commissioner. You kind of hit it right on the spot, and I couldn't agree more with what you just said. I wanted to clarify a little bit about when I used the term incrementalization last September 20th session, and I didn't really mean that you replace RTO with an incremental approach like we have today. I think what I was trying to say is that, you know, Northwest has been a very unique region in itself, as Commissioner Tani said. You know, Bonneville, a non-jurisdictional utility that owns and operates almost 70% of the high voltage transmission in the region. It's hard to get around and be able to get everything that probably an RTO requires for a non-jurisdictional entity as Bonneville to be part of it. There are statutory limitations and other legalities that I'm probably not the best suited person to talk about. But if you look at the history, it took us about 4 years just to form a regional planning organization, Northern Grid. And that's just one functionality of many that an RTO serves. When I said incremental was to build a trustworthy relationship across the footprint amongst multiple stakeholders, which an RPO, as Northern Grid did do eventually. The Western RA program is getting us there. The EIM with Bonneville announcing that they will be joining in 2022. All those are incremental steps that moves us probably closer to an RTO construct. It doesn't take us directly to an RTO, but it builds a pathway to get to and eventually maybe to an RTO, whether that RTO will be sort of I'll just use it for the discussion purposes here, a Northwest Power Pool sort of a footprint RTO, or whether it'll be a Westwide RTO. For the reasons that you mentioned about the Western Interconnection RTO, I think the same challenges and questions have been existing in my mind particularly, and probably might be shared with several other members at Bonneville. I just won't speak for the whole Bonneville as a whole at this point. But incremental approach is about testing and learning from it so that we can enhance our ability to get to eventually to an RTO position by looking and considering the diversity that exists within the decision-making processes of a jurisdictional commingled with a non-jurisdictional and a federal entity on top of it. So I think that's what I meant by incremental approach, and I think by no means am I saying that that incremental approach should offset ever considering an RTO formation. I think it's about taking the incremental approach to get to an RTO by building trustworthy partnerships and relationships, understanding the gaps and the challenges, and then overcoming those challenges in a manner that we can get to a successful point. Previous efforts have not resulted in an RTO formation for many of the similar reasons, but it doesn't mean that we have to go that same direction again and land in the same place. Now, I know there are probably folks that are going to say, well, you know, we need an RTO today because if we don't, we're not going to be able to meet the state policy goals that have been established that are, you know, and I don't necessarily agree or disagree. You know, to get to a state policy goal of 100% clean, whether in Oregon or 2045 in the state of Washington, at least to me, there are other considerations that are outside the RTO that needs to be completed and handled and tackled, because there'll be the same issues that will be faced in an RTO that we already discussed today in the question number 6 of planning and operation and in the environmental impact. So I just wanted to offer that clarification for what I meant by incremental approach and what I think that incremental approach can result in. Whether we do it in an accelerated manner or whether we do it in a sequence manner, that remains to be seen. But that is generally my comment that I'd like to offer. I took too many minutes for that, but hopefully I made my point across.
No, I appreciate that, Ravi. I see Spencer next, and then Mary. I want to say we're really getting close to approaching time here. I was just about done. I had a next step slide I did want to review with folks. If we can hold over for a few minutes, if everyone's okay with that, I can keep us going here. So Spencer, I saw next, and then Mary.
Thanks, Adam. For NIPSEA's part, we really support the incremental steps that have been taken so far. The EIM is a positive development for the West, both in how it saves consumers money and how it's developed, I think, a better set of practices and expectations for coordination and understanding each other's systems. And the possibility of having the expansion of what the CAISO is offering the region as a platform in a day-ahead market, which is a much more robust, larger volume market with more liquidity, I think that extends that incremental value to the region. The resource adequacy program, similarly, is a great development that's really important to keep the lights on more than anything, and to make sure that entities across the region are using the same standards and not counting on the same increasingly rare capacity resources to keep the lights on. But what NIPSEA's defined incrementalism as in our discussions internally is how far can you go with those valuable but limited regional conversations to a point where there's not an extra way to bolt on some function to our existing institutions. And I think we're approaching that point in the existing incremental processes that are underway or already launched, like EIM. In other words, I think we're going to get up to the edge of not being able to do much more to evolve our grid to deal with emerging issues like the commitment of Washington and Oregon to 100% clean grids. We're not to that edge yet. I think perhaps the day-ahead market possibility will be the edge of that functionality that can be bolted on to our existing grid without a more fundamental shift, which an RTO represents. But I think we should be mindful that we can only go so far with incrementalism. And there's a whole tranche of functions in the market and outcomes that are not possible with a perpetual incremental approach, and keeping our eye on the fact that at some point we've got to decide, are we going to make the jump into a different formed function and grid than we have today? And so that's how we sort of sequence the complementarity of the incremental steps with what we think an RTO offers in addition to those things. Thanks.
Thank you, Spencer. Mary?
Thanks, Adam. I think I just wanted to emphasize a little bit something that I heard Ravi saying, and I think there's a real tension here, kind of related to the urgency with which we are having the conversation around decarbonization, which is very urgent, as quickly as possible, 100% by 2035. The conversation, I think, is really about urgency and really about accelerating the decarbonization process. And I think there's a lot of things that are needed to achieve that, including potentially an RTO. However, I think there's real tension there because an RTO is going to take a long time to put together and to put in place. And I don't know how to advise on sort of accelerating the development of an RTO. I mean, we've heard today all of the different issues that come into the conversation, all of the things that need to be figured out, you know, all of the jurisdictional and governance issues. They're all really challenging problems to solve. And I don't know that there's a way around kind of how long it will take. So to me, looking at incrementalism is partly a way to kind of see, okay, kind of what Ravi was talking about, what can we get done at moving in the direction of an RTO or in support of an RTO, but can we get done more quickly and put into place more quickly that where we can start to feel some of the benefits or start to realize some of the benefits before we have the time and space to kind of get all the way there.
Thank you for that. And I don't see any other hands, and we are over time. So I wanted to quickly get to, I'll skip this one, which was a what's missing. We've kind of had this question asked many times. Next steps. So SB 589 requires us to convene this committee twice, which we've just concluded or imminently concluding. Do we need to meet for a third time? We got through all the material that I was hoping to get through. Thank you all so much for the time and effort you put in both to the written feedback and then spending 8 hours with us to talk through it in detail. I think we have ample information. The challenge now is identifying exactly how to synthesize and elevate that to the legislature. That said, if there is interest in having a third meeting, whatever form that looks, let me know now. I don't personally see a reason to do it. I feel like we've covered the material and we could always talk more on this stuff, but so let me know. Otherwise, draft reports we'll be working on in consultation with the PUC over the next month. And as I've mentioned earlier, we'll provide a minimum of 2 weeks for you all to review, and we'll get it out to you no later than Wednesday, November 24th. Hopefully it's sooner than that, but we'll do it as quickly as we can to get you a draft. And again, thank you again. It's been really great, and you guys spent a lot of time and effort in contributing to this effort to help us inform the legislature. So I've had a public comment slide here, but we've already gone to public comments. One note for those interested, we are running several other studies that are tangential to this effort in many ways. Just flagging that here if you're interested. Mentioned earlier by Representative Marsh, a small-scale renewable energy study. There's also a floating offshore wind study and an effort on renewable hydrogen. So if you're interested, take a look at our website. And thank you again. And enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. And I will be in touch via email with all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adam.
Thanks, Adam. Take care.
Thanks, Adam.
Nice job, Adam.